Good evening, friends. In tonight's story, we will discuss the most twisted, disturbing, and unsettling jobs people held in ancient history, the roles that were quietly vital to empires, but rarely spoken of in clean language. Not all work was noble. Not every job built temples or wrote poetry. Some labored in the shadows, cursed, feared, or pitied. They tested poison with their own tongues, rubbed the sewers of empires by hand, held down human sacrifices, or cried at funerals for families they never knew. These were the forgotten workers who kept the machinery of ancient civilizations running. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories whispered at best, but tonight we will remember them. Before we begin, support my work by liking the video and subscribing if you enjoy it. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always makes me smile to see people from all over the world tuning in. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and relax. You're just about to drift off with a story. Now we will look at the life of a royal food taster, a person who lived between kings and poison, whose every meal was a gamble with death. The banquet hall is glowing with oil lamps and golden vessels, filled with music and the murmur of silks. Slaves hurry past with bronze trays, sweet perfumes cloud the air, and roasted meats glisten under flickering firelight. A king sits high on his throne, surrounded by nobles and generals, jesters and spies. But behind the curtain of laughter and feasting, one figure waits in stillness. He does not drink, he does not smile. He watches the plate, not the performance. He is the food taster, and while the rest of the court eats for pleasure, he eats to survive. Food tasting is one of the oldest forms of royal defense, older than steel armor, older even than written law. Long before kings had personal guards, they had people to eat their meals first. Because in ancient courts, whether Persia or Rome, Egypt or Han China, the most elegant plate was sometimes the deadliest. Poison was a quiet killer. A tool of coos and whispers, it left no wound, made no noise. And so, to every great ruler, a humble servant was given a single, terrifying task: taste the meal before the ruler did. But who were these people? They were not always low-born slaves. In many courts, food tasters were trusted officials, chosen for their loyalty, trained to detect not only flavor, but threat. In Persia, the job was often held by eunuchs, not because they were expendable, but because they had no children, no political future. No one could use them as leverage. In Rome, the role was more formal. Known as the pregustator, the food taster often lived within the palace grounds. He dined separately, under strict observation, and was assigned to high-ranking patricians, generals, or emperors. One such man served the paranoid Emperor Claudius, who, despite a rotating team of tasters and a full-time herbalist on hand, was eventually poisoned by his own wife, Agrippina. The food taster in that case killed instantly, long before the emperor even touched his plate. The profession was unforgiving. A day in the life of a food taster begins before the kitchen fires are even lit. At the break of dawn, he walks the inner courtyard of the palace alone, breathing in the cool air before the scent of roasting in spice chokes it. His tunic is plain. He is allowed no rings, no concealed flasks, no hidden blades. Even his fingernails are inspected. He first visits the kitchen, not for breakfast, but for inspection. Each cook must present their ingredients for that day's meal. Meat is sliced in half. Water and wine are sampled separately. Grains are sifted for powder. Mushrooms identified by color and bruise. Herbs are the most dangerous and the most difficult to trace. The taster knows dozens by scent: wolfsbane, hemlock, monkshood, deadly nightshade. Some kill slowly over hours. Others cause convulsions in minutes. A few mimic indigestion. Some mimic sleep. And poison isn't always added at the end. Sometimes it's baked into the crust, soaked into the wine, folded into honey. Some poisoners even hide it in the vessel itself, a cup or knife that releases toxins when moistened. The food taster watches it all. Then he eats, not a full meal, Just a portion from each item, one bite of pheasant, one sip of diluted wine, a slice of fig, a spoonful of lentils, a piece of sweet bread glazed with pomegranate. He chews slowly, and he waits. 10 minutes, sometimes longer. The cooks observe him, silently, nervously. If his throat tightens, they will flee. If his face flushes, someone will be dragged away. But most days, nothing happens. He swallows, he bows, he leaves. This does not mean the food is safe, only that it wasn't dosed that morning. Poisons can be slow, cumulative. Some are made to mimic ordinary sickness. So after the meal, he walks the rest of the day under a cloud of quiet dread. He works, he rests, he reads sometimes, but he always listens to his own body. Too warm, too cold? Is the dizziness from the sun or something darker? He's not paranoid. He is alive because he notices. Not all food tasters served in palaces. In the Han Dynasty of China, food testers were often court eunuchs or favored slaves. They lived in chambers near the emperor's kitchens and were sometimes trained in medicine. One such figure, Wen Ji, recorded his own notes on tea testing for the emperor. He described in careful characters how even the clay of a teacup could affect the balance of life. Wen Ji once reported a strange numbness in his tongue after tasting a soup brought by a visiting noble. The emperor ordered the noble executed. The poison was later found embedded in the silver spoon, coated with mercury resin designed to dissolve when heated. The food taster's tongue had saved the throne, but not all were so fortunate. In India, under the Mauryan Empire, the court of Chandragupta employed both tasters and Vishakanya, poison maidens. These women were raised from youth on small doses of venom until their very breath was believed deadly. They were used not only for seduction, but for testing poisons, both for dosage and effectiveness. One was said to have died after kissing a rose laced with arsenic. Her body was burned in silence. No songs. No name. What kind of person accepts such a job? Some are born into it. In certain courts, it is hereditary, a family that serves, generation after generation, like blacksmiths or scribes. Others are promised land, title, or favor. A poisoned taster may be buried with honor, his children fed from the palace kitchens for life. But this does little comfort the man who chews the first bite of every feast, not knowing if it will be his last. Some do it for loyalty, others for proximity to power, some because they have no other choice. But all of them, every food taster, learns to live in the space between mouthful and moment, between the flavor of wine and the silence that follows. They learn to smile at the king even when their stomach tightens. They learn to sleep without dreaming. They learn to eat carefully. At night, the palace sleeps in silks and shadows. The music ends, the fire dims, the cups are emptied. But in a small chamber near the kitchen, the food taster still lies awake. He rubs his stomach, counts his breaths, tries to recall the aftertaste of the honey he licked from the spoon. Was it bitter? His heart races, then slows. Then he sleeps. And if he wakes tomorrow, he will do it again. Now we will descend beneath the roar of Rome's most infamous monument, the mighty Colosseum, where the air is thick with dust and fear, and where a man stands in a torchlit corridor, holding a rusted iron pole, his eyes locked on a snarling lion. Above him, crowds cheer and chant for blood. They are here to see death, theatrical, savage, and unforgettable. But before a single claw is unsheathed, before the arena gates creak open, before the show begins, someone must bring the beasts to the stage. That someone is the animal handler, a man who risks everything for a job no one envies, controlling the wild for the sake of Roman entertainment. He stands now, alone but for two nervous assistants in the Hypogeum, the dark underground level beneath the Colosseum's sandy floor. Around him are cages made of wood and iron, stacked amphorae of spoiled meat, old ropes, pulleys, and wheeled platforms. The stone walls drip with moisture. The corridors smell of hay, blood, and feces. In one cage, a lion is pacing. Its ribs heave. Its golden eyes flick from man to torch, torch to man. It has not eaten today. The handler knows this, on purpose. The hungrier the lion, the more ferocious the spectacle. He holds a long iron rod with a barbed end. It's not a weapon. It's just enough to guide, not to kill. Killing a beast like this is expensive. Lions must be kept alive until they serve their purpose. The lion's name, the handler doesn't know. He stopped naming them years ago. They arrive on ships from Numidia, Libya, and Ethiopia, trapped in nets, drugged with wine, forced into crates. Many die on the journey. Some arrive mad from thirst. Others die in cages before ever seeing the sun of Rome. But this one is strong. The handler stares at it through the bars. He knows its breath. He knows the way it plants its paws before it charges. He knows that tonight it will face a condemned prisoner in front of thousands. But getting it into the arena, that's the real danger. "Ready the cage lift," he mutters to his assistants. One nods and hurries to the wheel mechanism. A platform creaks. A series of pulleys groan. Above, a trap door waits to open. All that stands between chaos and control is the handler. He takes a deep breath. His tunic is soaked. His hand trembles slightly. The torchlight dances on the lion's fur. He prods the door open. The lion growls. He is only seconds. He shouts. Not in Latin, but in clicks and hisses, sounds he's learned over years of watching beasts. He slaps the pool against the bars. The lion growls again, lowers its head, and steps forward, onto the lift platform. "Now," he barks. With a deep clatter of gears, the platform begins to rise, carrying the lion slowly toward the arena floor. The trapdoor above slides open. A burst of daylight spills down. The crowd roars. The animal handler sags against the wall, heart pounding. That was just one line. There are 30 more animals in the hypogeum today. Leopards, bears, wolves, even an elephant brought in for a mock battle. All must be managed. All must be fed, cleaned, calmed, or provoked depending on the show. Sometimes the handler must starve them. Sometimes he must beat them. Sometimes he must whisper to them in the dark, trying to ease their panic. The lions are the worst. The handler rarely survives more than 5 years. Most are maimed. A missing hand, a blinded eye, a face torn by claws. Rome does not reward caution. The audience wants fury. They cheer when a lion kills a prisoner in seconds. They boo when the beast is sluggish or confused. And if the beast kills the wrong person, a soldier or a noble guest, it's the handler who pays the price. Some handlers die right here, behind the scenes, dragged into a cage while changing water, pounced on while loading a platform, bitten by a panther mid-transport. The hypogeum is lined with old bloodstains that never fully fade. Still, the job is essential. Without the handler, there is no venatio, the beast hunt. There are no executions by wild animal, no exotic exhibitions of giraffes or rhinos, no triumphal scenes of man conquering nature. The empire demands spectacle, and the handler supplies it. He's not a noble, he's not a soldier, he's barely a citizen, but he is known in every corner of the arena's underworld. Other workers nod to him with grim respect. He walks with a limp, a reminder from last year when a bear caught him across the back. His voice is low, he drinks alone. His hands are calloused, burned from hot chains and stained with old meat. He doesn't smile anymore. Only one thing gives him peace. A moment just before the beast rises into the arena, when the world goes still. In that breath, he feels power. He controls the uncontrollable. Even the lion, with its jaws and muscle and rage, listens to his command. Of course, it's an illusion. One mistake, one stumble, and he'll be the meal instead of the master. But for now, he lives. As the next lift is readied, he moves to the second cage. Another lion, this one older, with a torn ear and cracked fang, A survivor, like him. He eyes it warily. The beast stares back. Another prod, another whispered command, another ascent into chaos. The crowds above will cheer. The emperor may even give a thumbs down. Another life will end in blood. But none of that matters down here. Here, in the flickering dark of Rome's underbelly, the animal handler moves from cage to cage, breathing the sour air of hay and flesh, trying not to think about tomorrow. Because tomorrow, another ship arrives, another beast, another show. And maybe, just maybe, another lion that doesn't listen. Now we will turn to the cracked sands of a Roman training ground, the ludus, where men bled not for war, but for spectacle. In the blinding Mediterranean sun, beneath the shadow of a crumbling amphitheater, a hoarse voice echoes across a courtyard of dust and sweat. It belongs to a lanista, the feared and foul-mouthed master of gladiators. His voice is raspy from years of barking commands. His sandals are caked in dry blood and sand. His tunic is stained with old wine and fresh bruises, not his, but those of his men. To the crowd, the lanista is invisible. To the gladiators, he is everything. He is not just a trainer. He is owner, punisher, recruiter, choreographer, and butcher, all in one. His charges are not soldiers or athletes. They are slaves, prisoners, condemned men, or the desperate poor who sold their bodies for a shot at glory. Some are Gauls with long braided hair, others are Greeks who once taught philosophy, still others are North Africans with branded skin. In Rome's ludi, all bleed the same. The lanist watches them now, 24 men in loincloths and padded armor, locked in endless drills beneath a merciless sun. Left parry, right thrust, he shouts, again, or I'll feed you to the pigs before the crowd gets the chance. The men obey, their wooden swords splintering from repeated strikes. Their arms tremble, blood trickles from torn blisters. The sand beneath them is no longer golden, but rust-stained from 100 wounds. There is no glory here, only routine. 100 repetitions before breakfast. Another 100 before they see water. Then sparring, then more drills. This is the life of a gladiator, and this is the domain of the lanista. He is both master and jailer. The men he trains are chained at night. They sleep in cramped cells beneath the training yard. Their food is coarse barley mash and beans, high in fat to grow muscle. Their wounds are treated by slaves, or, if lucky, by a retired physician kept by the school. Infection is common. So is death. Yet the Lannister shows no softness. He's seen men cry for their mothers on the first day, seen others try to run and be hunted down by dogs. He knows which ones will survive. He can see it in the eyes, not just strength, but cruelty, hunger, calculation. He knows how to mold them. Each morning, he walks the line, inspecting arms, legs, scars. He picks out the weak, has them thrown back into drills or assigned to lighter matches. The strong he grooms, not for freedom, but for fame. The best fighters become stars, their names whispered in markets, their images painted on amphorae. But first, they must survive the arena. And before that, him. The lanista teaches more than how to fight. He teaches how to die well, how to fall gracefully, how to play to the crowd. A gladiator who stumbles like a coward will be mocked, even if he wins. A man who dies with dignity, sword in hand, may be remembered. That's what he tells them. It's a lie. The crowd forgets everything except blood. Still, he trains them. Raise your shield higher, Thracian, he barks. You fight like a fishmonger's daughter. The Thracian grunts, wiping sweat from his brow. His arm is bruised from yesterday's match, but he lifts the shield. The lanista nods. Improvement. Behind the practice yard is the punishment post. A tall wooden stake stained dark with old blood. Men who disobey, who show fear, who insult the art, are tied there and whipped. Not to death, just enough to remind them of their place. The lanista does not enjoy this, not anymore. He used to. In his youth, he was a fighter too. That's the part no one talks about. Almost every lanista was once a gladiator, a man who killed or nearly died in front of jeering Romans beneath the banners of governors and emperors. He fought for coins he never kept, for cheers that faded like smoke. Some were granted freedom after 100 victories. Others bought it with their blood. But the arena never leaves you. So, many stay. Too broken for the army, too scarred for trade, too feared for marriage. They become trainers, tacticians, cattle drivers of men. That's what the lanista is now. His body is a map of scars. One eye droops slightly, the result of a mace blow in his final match. His fingers are bent from too many years of gripping weapons. His voice is hoarse. His heart, indifferent. He keeps scrolls on each fighter: age, origin, skill level, market value. He sells some to other ludi. He leases others to wealthy patrons who want a private show. Sometimes he arranges mock naval battles, flooding the arena with water and fitting his men with waterproof leather. It's a business, a grim, bloody business. But it feeds him, clothes him, gives him a kind of power. When visiting nobles tour the city, they often ask to visit his school. They laugh at the sight of naked men wrestling in the mud. They ask questions. Can the German lift that rock? How much for the dark-skinned one with the scar? The lanista smiles. He answers politely, but inside he is calculating. He knows which men are nearing the end, which ones might survive a few more matches, which ones should be saved for a festival day, when the amphitheater is full, when the crowd is drunk on wine and bloodlust. He also knows which ones dream of killing him in his sleep. That's why he sleeps lately. That's why he keeps a dagger beneath his cot. The ludus is not just a school, it's a pressure cooker. Men from every province, every background shoved together in chains. Tempers flare, rivalries explode, fights break out at night. Some men try to hang themselves with their bedding. Others stab each other with stolen nails. The lanista watches it all. Sometimes he punishes, sometimes he lets it play out. The weak eliminate themselves. Saves him the trouble. But not all is chaos. There are moments of eerie beauty. The rhythm of training drills in the morning light, the sudden silence before a sparring match begins, the way a seasoned fighter moves like a dancer, blade flashing like silver. In these moments, the lanista remembers why he stayed. It's not the money, it's not even the power, it's the craft. The transformation. Watching a terrified slave become a champion, watching the crowd rise to its feet as his men, his creations, fight like gods. But he never claps, never cheers, just watches from the shadows, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Back in the courtyard, drills are ending. One man stumbles, exhausted. Another vomits in the corner. The sun is setting. Blood crusts over a fresh cut. Somewhere, a crow calls. The lanista walks through his ranks. He says nothing, just nods once. They's done. Tomorrow, they'll train again. Tomorrow, they'll fight again. And he will shout, and they will bleed, and the sands will drink it all without complaint. This is the world of the lanista, where pain is currency, and men are molded not to live, but to die well. Now we will leave behind the soft murmur of temples and the bustle of markets, and step instead into the path of a man whose arrival could bring silence, curses, or tears. A man whose voice was feared more than a general's, and whose ledger could weigh heavier than a sword. He carries no blessings, no healing, no goods to trade. He carries a scroll and a seal. He is the tax collector. Across ancient and medieval empires, tax collectors were the living edge of the state's hunger. They were not born to kindness, nor were they trained in mercy. Their duty was not to teach, heal, or serve, but to extract. And they did so with a precision as cold as iron, and a cruelty that often blurred the line between law and extortion. Let us begin in ancient Mesopotamia, where the first known tax records were inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. In cities like Lagash and Uruk, the tax collector was a royal appointee known as a sibsibum. He traveled with scribes and soldiers, visiting farms to count livestock, grain stores, and laborers. If a man owned 10 goats, one must be taken. If a field yielded 10 bushels, one was carted away. But what if the harvest was poor? What if the goats had died? That mattered little. The quota was fixed by decree. If the goods could not be paid, then labor was demanded in return. Days in the fields, nights hauling bricks, or worse, the forced giving of a child to temple service or slavery. The tax collector's word was final. He held a clay cylinder sealed by the king, a symbol of absolute authority. To defy him was to invite ruin. The people learned to fear the dust of his sandals, the ink of his stylus, and the crack of his whip. Now let us walk west, into the structured precision of the Roman Empire, where taxation was both a science and a source of constant unrest. Roman tax collectors were known as publicani, private contractors who bid on tax collection rights for provinces. Once a region was secured, the publicanus and his agents would collect more than what was owed, keeping the surplus as profit. This system, called tax farming, was legal and brutal. They were not gentle. In Judea, they were called traders and thieves. In Gaul, they traveled with guards. In Egypt, they inspected grain silos and dockyards, marking cargo with wax seals and dragging off any man who couldn't pay. A Roman tax agent might enter a village with 2 items, a scroll listing names and debts, and a squad of auxiliaries with clubs. He could seize livestock, homes, or even family members. There were reports of families selling daughters to avoid arrest, of men hiding in caves, and of suicides to escape debt. And when rebellion stirred, as it often did, it was not because of war, but taxes. Even emperors feared the backlash. Nero forgave taxes for entire provinces. Trajan banned tax farming in key regions. But still, the system persisted, and the taxman's shadow grew ever longer. Let us now cross the sands into the empires of Islam, where taxation was refined through theology, law, and administration. In the Abbasid Caliphate, taxes were divided into categories: zakat, charity tax; kharaj, land tax; jizya, poll tax on non-Muslims, and more. On paper, they were fair. In practice, enforcement was often harsh. Tax collectors, known as amil or musaddiq, traveled with ledgers and legal edicts. They were to act justly, weighing claims and ensuring the poor were not overburdened. But not all followed the ideal. In border provinces like Khorasan or North Africa, tax collectors were feared more than raiders. They inspected fields, audited property, and interrogated merchants. Villages accused them of taking bribes from the wealthy and punishing only the poor. Some carried rods, others rode with soldiers. In times of famine, the tax was not lowered. Instead, collectors demanded future harvests, taking land titles as collateral. Generations of farmers lost their holdings not to war, but to the ink of a collector's brush. In the mosques, imams preached restraint. In palaces, viziers debated reform, but in the streets, mothers wept when the taxmen came. Traveling east, we now find ourselves under the banners of imperial China, where dynasties rose and fell in part because of the tax burden. Under the Tang dynasty, tax collectors were agents of the emperor's bureaucracy. They were required to pass tests, keep orderly records, and report to regional magistrates. But as the empire grew, corruption followed. A farmer in Sichuan might find his name duplicated in records, taxed twice. A merchant in Luoyang might be fined for failing to report a shipment even if he had no goods. A widow might pay tax on her husband's death, and again on his grave. Collectors, known as shuili, were not supposed to use force, but they often did. Whips were illegal but used. Bribes were forbidden but expected. Some collectors enriched themselves, while peasants fled into forests and mountains. In Song Dynasty records, one tale stands out: a collector who forced villagers to sell their children into labor to pay land taxes. When the village elder protested, he was bound and left in a riverbed to die. The emperor never heard of it, but the people did not forget. Now let us travel to the Mughal Empire, where tax collectors operated under a more systematic structure, yet were no less feared, known as amils, or revenue officers. They oversaw large areas, reporting to the central administration in Delhi or Agra. Land was surveyed, crops estimated, and tax levied accordingly. But the collector's estimate often exceeded the real yield. In Bengal, collectors took a share of rice before the harvest. In Punjab, they took cattle. If a farmer refused, his tools were seized, his fields were burned. Some taxmen kept personal jails, where debtors were locked for weeks. Akbar the Great tried to reform the system. He introduced fixed rates and banned middlemen. But after his reign, abuses returned. During Aurangzeb's rule, entire regions were driven to rebellion by tax burdens. In poetry and folk songs, the tax collector became a villain. He was described as a man who smiled with one hand and bled you with the other. Children were told not to make noise, lest they wake the collector. Even among nobles, taxmen were mistrusted. They grew rich quickly, surrounded by guards and servants, but their lives were often short. They died by dagger, poison, or the emperor's wrath. In medieval Europe, tax collectors became symbols of tyranny, especially under monarchies struggling to fund wars and luxuries. In France, under the Capetians and later the Valois kings, tax collectors levied forced payments on peasants and merchants. They traveled with priests to bless the collection, but also with knights to ensure compliance. They took tithes in grain, eggs, cloth, or coin. If a village failed to pay, its mill could be destroyed. Fields could be salted. Families starved in silence, praying for plague or invasion to bring change. In England, the tax collector became an agent of fear after the Norman conquest. Under King John, taxes were raised brutally to fund wars in France. Tax collectors grew so hated that they were stoned in towns. Rebels in the countryside left their bodies hanging from trees. One famous revolt, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, was sparked by tax demands. The collectors came with swords, demanding payments from even the poorest, and when they tried to inspect a peasant girl for hidden wealth, the village rose up, the collector was killed, the fire spread. Even the church had its taxmen. The papal tithe collector, known as the decimator, visited parishes to collect money for Rome. He was viewed as a parasite, taking from starving farmers to fund distant cathedrals. Bishops begged for moderation, but the collectors answered only to Rome. They rode with guards, they never traveled alone, and when they died, no church bells rang for them. Across all empires, tax collectors shared one thing in common. They were never loved. They were feared. They were bribed. They were cursed in stories and buried without honor. But they were necessary. Without them, kings could not build roads, empires could not field armies, courts could not issue justice, even temples relied on their hated scrolls. Yet they remained outsiders. Their homes were watched, their children taunted, their deaths unmourned, because they carried not swords, but laws. And in the end, it was the law that starved you. Now we will pass through the hushed corridors of palaces where silence spoke louder than orders, and where a single glance from a ruler could decide life or death. Here, at the gilded doors of royal chambers, stood figures both feared and forgotten. Eunuch gatekeepers, castrated men tasked with guarding the inner sanctums of ancient empires. To be a eunuch was not a profession one chose, it was a condition, imposed either in childhood or in early youth. The procedure was brutal, performed without modern anesthesia, and often without consent. A blade or heated knife removed either part or all of a boy's genitals, depending on the culture. Some bled to death. Some died of infection. Those who survived were reshaped, not only in body, but in fate. Eunuchs were created to serve in the most sensitive places: harems, treasuries, archives, royal chambers. Their altered status made them trustworthy, or so emperors believed. Without bloodlines of their own, they posed no dynastic threat. Without sexual desire, They were assumed to be safe among queens, concubines, and court ladies. And without families, they belonged wholly to the state. The gatekeeper among them was perhaps the most paradoxical of all. He stood at the threshold between power and privacy. He was the last barrier before the throne room. He was the watcher at the entrance to the harem. He held the keys, literal and figurative, to chambers filled with secrets, schemes, and unspoken hierarchies. In imperial China, eunuchs guarded the gates to the forbidden city. They were said to move like shadows, to speak only when spoken to. Dressed in silk uniforms, often dyed in colors reserved for their rank, they controlled who came and went. Some served in the 6 ministries, but the most trusted served in the inner court, the domain of the emperor's personal life. To reach such a position, a eunuch had to survive decades of politics, suspicion, and ritual. He had to know when to speak, when to bow, when to disappear. His loyalty was constantly tested. A whisper of betrayal meant death. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs, known as Kislar Agassi, or chief black eunuchs, were brought from Africa, castrated young, and trained for palace life. They oversaw the imperial harem, a universe of hundreds of women, children, guards, and slaves. Only eunuchs were permitted entry. At the gates stood layers of guards, each controlled by eunuchs of ascending rank. Their job was not only to guard, but to monitor. They read letters before they left the harem. They eavesdropped on conversations. They enforced the sultan's will and punished disobedience with silent precision. Some wielded immense influence, whispering into royal ears, deciding who lived or died, who rose or fell, and yet they were utterly alone. Despite their proximity to rulers, eunuch gatekeepers were rarely treated as equals. They had no kin, no heirs, no lasting place in the social order. Their rooms were small, their names rarely recorded. Even their graves were often unmarked. In Byzantine Constantinople, eunuchs could rise to immense power, even become generals or regents. But those who served as chamber guards lived by a strict code. They stood for hours at ornate bronze doors, holding spears or staffs adorned with the imperial crest. Some were assigned to guard relics or sacred objects. Others stood outside the emperor's bedchamber, no matter the hour. It was a job of stillness. Imagine standing motionless for hours in thick robes, through bitter winters and sweltering summers, without showing pain or fatigue. Imagine watching as lovers, ministers, or spies passed by you and saying nothing. Imagine hearing secrets not meant for your ears and knowing you could never repeat them. The job aged men early. Many developed joint pain, arthritis, or eye problems from candle smoke and poor lighting. Some went blind from long hours in dark halls. Others were simply forgotten once they grew old, replaced by younger, quieter men. Despite this, many eunuch gatekeepers found pride in their work. They served empires. They protected sacred chambers. They enforced divine order. Some even carved messages into the walls of their posts, small inscriptions saying, "I stood here for the emperor," or "This door opened only by my hand." There are stories of gatekeepers who refused to open a door even to generals, insisting on imperial orders. There are stories of emperors testing their loyalty with bribes and being impressed by their refusal. But there are also darker tales of eunuchs who let assassins through, or who passed poisoned food into royal bedrooms, or who betrayed queens for a promise of dignity. Not all gatekeepers were passive. In some palaces, the eunuchs formed internal networks, sharing information, manipulating court factions, and protecting each other. In certain dynasties, they became kingmakers, controlling access so tightly that they effectively ruled behind the throne. Their power was invisible, but immense. But in most cases, the eunuch gatekeeper lived a life of routine, of obedience, and of silence. His footsteps were muffled, his voice was soft, his hands, often gloved, touched nothing without permission. He witnessed the birth of princes, the death of kings, the exile of wives. He stood just outside the door when emperors made love, when queens wept, when traitors confessed. He was there, always there, but never truly seen. Some gatekeepers kept journals. In China, fragments remain of eunuch memoirs, written in shaky calligraphy, hidden in walls or buried in tombs. These writings speak of longing, of fear, of pride, of dreams unfulfilled. One eunuch described his work as holding the key to a world that was never mine. He had no children, no lovers, no voice in council, only the key. In later centuries, as empires modernized, the role of eunuch gatekeepers faded. Surgical castration was outlawed in many places, harems shrank or disappeared. Courts became bureaucracies. But for over 1,000 years, in Persia, India, Byzantium, China, and the Ottoman world, the eunuch gatekeeper was a fixture. He was the last obstacle before the throne, the last witness before the murder, the last person to see the emperor's face before the door closed. And when the door shut, he remained on guard, always on guard, long after everyone else had forgotten his name. Now we will walk not into a battlefield or a temple, but into a public square. The air is still, the crowd gathers, eyes wary, murmurs hushed. A platform has been erected, simple and stark. Atop it stands a single man, dressed in robes that vary depending on the city. Sometimes faded crimson, sometimes black, sometimes gray as ashes. He holds a scroll, and when he opens his mouth, everyone listens. He is the punishment announcer, a figure feared and hated, sometimes pitied, but always noticed. His voice is the voice of the state. His breath delivers shame. His scroll carries the weight of empire. In a world without newsprint, without radio or screens, the announcer's word was final. To be named aloud in front of your community, to have your sins shouted from a platform before your family, your peers, your gods, was to suffer a kind of social death, often far worse than physical pain. Let us begin in ancient Mesopotamia, in the bustling cities of Ur or Babylon, where cuneiform tablets shaped the law and ziggurats towered like stairways to heaven. Here, under the Code of Hammurabi, punishment was often physical, branding, mutilation, or death. But first came the announcement. A herald would be summoned. He stood at the city gate or the temple steps. Around him, scribes, priests, and guards assembled. The scroll, a long sheet of clay or parchment, listed not only the offender's name, but his crime, lineage, and punishment. Let all know, Enlil, son of Aruk, has stolen barley meant for temple offerings. Let his hand be severed by decree of the gods and the king. And so it was. This public naming served a dual purpose, not just to shame, but to reinforce order. The punishment announcer was the mouthpiece of divine justice. He had no room for mercy. He read without emotion. He did not argue or console. His voice had to carry to the outer edge of the market. In ancient Rome, the role grew more theatrical. The praeco, or public crier, stood in the forum often at dawn. He rang a bell to gather the people, then unrolled his scroll, written by scribes, stamped by magistrates. In some cases, the punishment was already underway, a criminal whipped at the column of infamy, a runaway slave branded across the forehead. The announcer's job was not only to declare the crime, but to ensure the crowd understood its symbolism. This man, Publius Sertorius, has struck his father, a violation of pietas. He shall be beaten with rods and sent to exile. Let this be a warning to sons who forget their place. The praeco often wore no uniform. His status was low, and yet he held terrifying power. His voice could destroy reputations. Merchants bribed him to skip their names. Senators whispered in his ear to embarrass rivals. His scroll was a map of shame. He read daily, in rain and sun, to crowds that jeered or gasped, and when he misread a name, he risked his own punishment, for clarity was sacred, and error in judgment was not tolerated. In medieval Islamic cities, such as Baghdad, Cordoba, or Cairo, the role of the punishment announcer took on a more formal and even spiritual tone. Known as the Munadi, he was often affiliated with the Qadi's court, the religious judge. His voice not only announced punishment, but warned of infractions, declared fasts, called out new taxes, and summoned witnesses. But when it came to punishment, his scroll turned grave. He would walk through the bazaar with guards behind him, calling out the name and crime of the convicted, sometimes with the criminal tied beside him. By order of the Qadi of the district, Ismail ibn Faraj is found guilty of false testimony. He shall be beaten with 40 lashes in the square of the Olive Market. Sometimes, Mimuni was required to read aloud before the punishment, during and after, reinforcing not only the guilt, but the justice of the state. His scrolls were carefully penned. Each word had legal weight. To speak incorrectly was to commit fitna, or disorder, a sin that could end in his own flogging or dismissal. Yet he was not just a reader, he was a reciter, trained in breath control, in enunciation, in memory. His voice was his tool, and many were required to memorize long lists of names and crimes so that when a scroll was damaged, the sentence could still be delivered in full. In medieval China, the role evolved under dynasties that prized ritual and hierarchy. In cities like Chang'an or Hangzhou, punishment announcements were made at designated points, in front of government offices or public walls covered in edicts. The Gaowen Ren, or high crier, wore formal robes, often marked with the insignia of the local magistrate. He carried a bamboo staff, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of authority. He unrolled scrolls of silk or paper, inked in fine brushstrokes, and read with great dignity. By order of the district magistrate, Zhang Hui is guilty of embezzling grain from the emperor's granary. His family is stripped of rank. He is to be executed at sundown. Let none plead for him. Here shame extended beyond the individual. The scroll of shame tarnished entire households. A son might lose the right to take imperial exams. A daughter might be unmarriageable. And so the announcer's voice became a kind of social knife, cutting ties, reputations, futures. Some announcements were accompanied by placards hung around the criminal's neck, handwritten signs echoing the charges. These were often placed on corpses so that even in death, the condemned could not escape their guilt. In medieval Europe, especially under Christian rule, the punishment announcer became both bureaucrat and moralist. In town squares from Paris to Prague, the bellman or herald would ascend the scaffold before a hanging or burning. He would begin with a prayer, then unroll the parchment. Hear ye, this is Agnes, formerly of Lille. She has confessed to heresy, witchcraft, and consorting with devils. Let her soul be cleansed in flame, that others may not follow her path. The words were chosen to provoke fear and spiritual submission. The announcer often worked closely with inquisitors, reading confessions extracted under torture, framing the execution as divine mercy. In Protestant cities, the practice continued with added emphasis on civic betrayal. Thieves were named, debtors were shamed, adulterers were paraded. The scrolls were long, some over a yard in length, and read in full. Over time, many announcers were trained not only in voice but in performance. They gestured, paused for dramatic effect, and even incorporated psalms or parables. Some became minor celebrities, known for their deep tone or sharp wit, but all shared the same burden, the weight of other people's disgrace. They carried stories of murder, theft, rebellion, and blasphemy. They recited them day after day, often multiple times. They learned to speak without judgment, to become echoes of justice rather than men of it. And when the scroll was burned or the sentence carried out, they turned to the next name, the next scroll, the next shame. No one mourned the punishment announcer. No monuments were built in his name. No child dreamed of his job. But in every empire, every century, someone had to read the words. Who sinned? What law they broke? And what the world would now do in response. Now we will leave the shadowed corridors of palaces and descend into their courtyards. It is late morning. The sun is high, the air thick with heat and the scent of cut fruit. A figure moves slowly among rows of low stone tables, adjusting wooden frames and cloth-covered trays. On each tray lie delicate slices of plum, fig, apple, and lamb, spread thin and drying in the sun. This figure is no noble. He wears a stained tunic, arms darkened from days under open skies, eyes wary. And yet, his work touches royal lips. He is the royal food dryer, a servant who labors in silence, preserving the bounty of summer for the hunger of winter, guarding against mold, rot, and poison alike. His hands must be precise, his senses alert. His role, though unglamorous, is essential to the very survival of the palace. In a world without refrigeration, dried foods were the lifeblood of royal storage, portable, long-lasting, and easier to secure from decay or contamination. But drying was more than hanging meat on a hook. It was a science, a ritual, and at times, a high-stakes test of loyalty. Let us begin in the arid heart of ancient Persia, where the Achaemenid kings demanded dried apricots from the mountains, dried lamb from the Zagros highlands, and preserved fish from the southern coasts. Royal food dryers worked in the courtyards of Persepolis, not in kitchens, but in open spaces enclosed by high walls to keep out dogs, dust, and spies. Each morning, the food dryer rose before the sun, his first task, to inspect the trays. The dried apricots had to be flipped with fingers dusted in fine ash so they would not stick. The strips of lamb were tested by touch. Soft meant danger, brittle meant success. He sniffed for spoilage. He watched for insects. He shaded delicate fruits with linen screens, shifting them slowly as the sun moved westward. He knew the sun like others knew scripture. Too much heat, and the food would cook. Too little, and it would mold. Too much breeze, and dust would settle. Too much shadow, and mildew would bloom. The food dryer adjusted everything by hand, tilting slats, propping up trays, layering cloth. He moved with the sun, his eyes always squinting, his mouth covered in a damp cloth to protect the food from his breath. He was not allowed to speak while working, not to other servants, not to guards, not even to the kitchen overseer. Why? Because what he handled was too important. A spoiled rack of dried lamb could sicken a prince. A moldy fig might be mistaken for poison. Dried foods were often carried on long journeys, packed into ceramic jars and offered at foreign courts. The food dryer's mistake might be tasted hundreds of miles away, or worse, in front of an enemy. In some courts, food drivers were selected for their obedience, not their heritage. In Persia, it was not uncommon for a food dryer to be a eunuch, seen as more trustworthy, less tempted by intrigue or desire. Their quarters were small and separate. Their tools were marked with seals to prevent tampering. Their dried goods were locked nightly in rooms guarded by scribes, who logged every fig, every sliver of beef. The work was hot, repetitive, and punishing. The food dryer's back blistered in the sun. His skin cracked from salt. He was not permitted gloves. They might hide stolen items. He handled each item with bare, clean hands, washed in lime water and scraped with ash. He ate alone. If a single piece of dried plum went missing, he could be flogged. If meat was found with worms, he could be imprisoned or sold to another household. If a royal child fell ill after eating something he had dried, the punishment could be execution, or worse, exile without pay, a death sentence in disguise. Now let us cross the Mediterranean, to the palaces of Hellenistic Egypt, where pharaohs in Greek robes demanded delicacies from across the known world. The royal granaries and kitchens of Alexandria stretched for blocks, and in their sun-drenched courtyards stood long racks of drying fish, apricots, dates, and goose. Here, food dryers worked in teams, but each was assigned to a specific item. One man dried only dates, another duck, another strips of goat belly, cured with salt and vinegar before laying them to dry. They used stone slabs warmed by the sun. The slabs were rubbed with lemon, then olive oil to prevent sticking. Flies were a constant threat, so the food dryers used woven nets and small fires. with acrid herbs to smoke them away. Scribes observed from shaded alcoves, logging every tray and quantity. And once a week, a taster arrived, a eunuch with a silver tongue scraper, who sampled the dried fruits and meats. He did not eat them. He tested texture and odor. If he found fault, the food was discarded and the dryer punished. Egyptian dryers were also expected to dehydrate wine, a rare process where wine was simmered to syrup and then dried into cakes, stored for long voyages. Only the best food dryers were trusted with this. In Tang Dynasty China, royal food dryers wore brown or ochre robes and worked in a tiled compound near the palace kitchens. They hung slices of lotus root, pork belly, melon, and ginger on bamboo poles, which they rotated by hand throughout the day. Their drying process included smoke curing, which required careful layering of rice husks, pine needles, and dried herbs. The scent mattered. If the emperor preferred ginger to linger on the meat, the dryer had to adjust his smoke mixture. If too strong, he was scolded. If too faint, he was sent to clean latrines for a week. And in medieval Europe, where sunlight was less predictable, royal food dryers had to work faster, using salt curing and wind drying in combination. In castles of France and England, slabs of venison were hung from rafters beside slices of apple and pear. Food dryers here were often kitchen boys, promoted for their caution and quiet. They were not educated, but they had sharp instincts. They learned which breezes brought mildew. They kept beeswax to seal cracks in storage jars. They burned rosemary near the food to mask odors of rot, and they were expected to carry trays up and down spiral stairs into courtyards or tower tops, depending on the weather, several times a day. They were blamed when things went wrong, but never praised when things went right. The queen might savor a sweet prune in winter, the king might chew on spiced jerky while hunting, but the food dryer was not invited to watch or listen or speak. He returned to his racks, his baskets, his rows of jars and cloths. Over time, some food dryers learned to read weather signs better than the guards. They noticed patterns in birds, in dew, in how their own sweat dried on their forearms. They whispered these secrets only to themselves. Some families became generational food dryers, serving courts for decades. Their techniques passed quietly from father to son, never written down. A certain angle of slicing, a certain hour for flipping, a certain way to layer spices between meat strips. These were their legacies, unspoken but tasted. No one applauded them. No statues bore their names. But in every great meal that lasted past the harvest, in every feast that took place during famine, they were present, hidden beneath the sweetness of the fruit, the savor of the meat, the comfort of the past preserved in sunlight. They worked in silence. They bowed to the sun. They touched the food the world could not afford to spoil, and their hands fed kings. Now we will look at the life of a sower diver and gong farmer, the men who descended into filth so that the rest of civilization could live clean. The city above sleeps, its lamps flickering low behind shutters, its nobles wrapped in fine blankets. The streets are still, save for the dogs that sniff for scraps, and the wind that carries the scent of smoke, bread, and rot. But below it, beneath the stones and soil, something stirs. A quiet splash, the clatter of metal. A man grunts as he lowers himself into a hole carved through the stone floor. He is entering the city's bowels. His name is forgotten, his task reviled, but without him, Rome would stink. London would drown. Ancient cities, for all their splendor, sat atop sewers, tunnels clogged with waste, bone, broken clay, animal remains, and every foul thing flushed from polite society. This man is a gong farmer. In some places he is called a sower diver, in others simply nightman. But whatever the name, his work is the same. He enters the dark to clear what no one else will touch. In ancient Rome, the sewers were a marvel of engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer, was as wide as a road, running beneath the Forum and channeling runoff into the Tiber River. It was pride and necessity. Without it, Rome would choke on itself. But no aqueduct ran, forever clean. Trash built up. Human waste congealed, and someone had to climb in and break it apart. He does not wear armor or robes. His gear is crude: thick wool tunic, oiled leather apron, rope-bound sandals, a rod of bronze or iron, and most important, a torch sealed in glass, its flame low but steady, its smoke escaping through a reed chimney slung over the shoulder. He carries a bucket, sometimes two. The work begins before sunrise, when the streets are least traveled. He lifts a stone slab, and the stench rises like a blow to the face. It smells of old grease, mold, urine, fermented wine, offal, decay, wet stone. A chemical chorus of the city's stomach. He drops in, knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep in sludge. Rats hiss and scatter. He mutters something, not a prayer but a ritual phrase. Words passed down from other sewer workers, half superstition, half comfort. What flows away carries no name. The passage is tight, arched, dripping. He walks hunched, sweeping his pole through the muck, pushing aside clogs and tangled roots. Sometimes there are bones. Pig bones, chicken bones, sometimes human wood. He doesn't ask. In medieval Europe, the job was much the same, except worse. By the 13th century, London's latrines emptied into deep cesspits beneath homes, inns, and guild halls. There was no flowing water to wash it away, just layers of human waste, compacted over months. The pits had to be emptied by hand. Enter the gong farmer. His shift began at night, not for convenience, but to keep the stench away from daytime business. He was paid by the load, sometimes by the bucket. He descended into the pit with a shovel and filled barrels. The muck was hauled by cart to the fields outside town, dumped as fertilizer. The pay wasn't bad. In fact, for a peasant it was better than farm work. Some became wealthy, but no amount of coin could erase the stink. The smell clung to skin, to breath, to the soul. Gong farmers were banned from entering churches, from marrying into certain families, from walking through markets during midday. Their houses were built on the edge of town. Their children, if they could afford them, often lied about what their father did. Some wore gloves, others smeared their upper lips with vinegar or chewed herbs. A few learned to breathe only through the mouth. But nothing worked for long. In India, during ancient and medieval times, similar workers existed, though caste systems made the situation even more tragic. Members of Dalit communities, often labeled untouchables, were forced into sanitation labor. They carried buckets of waste from dry latrines on their shoulders. No gloves, no tools, no dignity. They were forbidden from touching food, entering temples, or even drawing water from public wells. They were seen not as people doing dirty work, but as people who were dirty by nature. And yet they were vital. Without them, towns would collapse in disease and ruin, and still they were treated with contempt. Their labor fed the crops, cleaned the streets, and saved thousands from cholera and typhoid. But their names were never written in the texts of kings. The sewer diver learns to move carefully. One misstep and he sinks. Some passages collapse. Some fill with gas. One torch too bright, one spark too wild, and an entire tunnel might explode from methane. It has happened. There are stories. Bodies found days later, burned and bloated. But he keeps moving. Not because he loves it, but because it must be done. In some cities, these men were employed by the state. In others, by guilds. In still others, they worked freelance, negotiating with taverns and landlords for access and coin. Occasionally, they'd find treasure. Coins dropped down drains. Rings lost to drunken missteps. Bones with gold teeth. A whole career could be funded on sewer scavenging alone, if the man had no shame and a strong enough stomach. Some didn't make it. They went mad from fumes, or sick from infections that ate the skin. or simply drowned in their own city's filth. And yet, without them, there is no city. There is no Rome, no London, no Delhi, no Edo. Because empires do not run on marble and myth alone. They run on the people who scrub, burn, bury, and haul away what no one else wants to touch. In the quiet of night, the gong farmer finishes his shift. He scrapes his boots with a dull blade, washes in cold river water again and again. But the smell does not go. Not from his hands, not from his soul. He walks home alone, and when he passes a lanterned inn, people wrinkle their noses and turn away. But inside they sleep soundly, because he went where they never would. Now we will look at the life of the executioner, the man whose hands delivered justice, whose presence silenced crowds, and whose soul bore the weight of every blade he raised. The square is silent, not the usual silence of dawn, but a strange, breathless stillness. A hush that spreads from doorway to rooftop, a hush thick with tension and fear. Even the birds seem to quiet. Even the wind stops at the edge of the scaffold. All eyes are on the platform of wood in the center of the square. A man is kneeling there, bound at the wrists. Another stands behind him, face hidden beneath a hood. His hand rests on an axe. He is not a soldier. He is not a judge. He is the executioner, and today, like so many days before, he must kill. Executioners have existed in every great civilization, from Mesopotamia to Meiji Japan, employed not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Societies that developed codes of law also needed someone to enforce the final, irreversible consequence. But while kings gave the order and judges wrote the sentence, it was the executioner who performed the act. It was his blade that split neck from spine, his rope that ended breath, his torch that lit the pyre. He was a figure of fear and solitude. In medieval France, the executioner held a unique legal status. He was often exempt from taxes, granted land, and given protection by the crown. Some cities even provided him a house at the edge of town, near the cemetery, where he would often bury his victims himself. But despite these privileges, he lived apart. He could not attend weddings. He could not touch bread in the market. No child would play with his own. His family bore his name like a brand. He was necessary and hated. In the Ottoman Empire, executioners were part of a shadowed bureaucracy. They wore black robes, walked without shoes, and answered only to the Sultan. Some were mute, all were feared. They used cords rather than blades, a silent, suffocating death. The cords were made of silk, braided tightly, pulled by two men on either side of the condemned. And when they finished, they were forbidden from speaking of it. They left through secret doors. And sometimes, if the condemned was noble, the executioners were executed afterward to protect secrets of the court. In Japan, under the Tokugawa shogunate, executioners were called Yamada. They belonged to the burakumin class, outcasts tasked with death, slaughter, and the disposal of corpses. Many came from butcher families. Some became experts in anatomy. A few were even known to perform tests of sword sharpness on condemned bodies, a gruesome but respected skill known as tameshigiri. But they could never marry outside their caste. Their homes were marked. Their lives lived in silence. What does a day look like for an executioner? It begins long before the sentence is carried out. He sharpens the blade, not too sharp or it will glance, not too dull or it will tear. He inspects the rope. He prepares the ground. He reads the names of the condemned in silence, mouthing each syllable like a prayer. He speaks to no one. He eats little. If he is lucky, he is allowed a drink, not for courage, but for numbness. He does not think of the crime. He does not think of innocence. He must be still. When the condemned arrives, the crowd gathers. Some jeer, some weep. But the executioner does not look at them. He stands behind the prisoner, measures the angle, aligns the axe, or blade, or noose, He waits for the signal, and then he moves. Clean, fast, without hesitation. If he falters, the punishment is his. There are records of executioners being executed themselves for a poor strike. In England, one failed to behead a noble after several swings. The king had him hanged for incompetence, so he does not fail. Afterward, he cleans the blade, washes his hands, removes the clothes worn that day, and buries them. In some traditions, he burns incense. In others, he drinks alone. He speaks to no one. And when he walks home, children scatter, doors close, but the city sleeps easier. Was he cruel? Not always. Some were gentle, some whispered apologies, some said nothing, because they had no words left. There are tales of executioners who retired with heavy hearts, men who never married, never slept soundly, who saw the eyes of the condemned in every dream. And one Ottoman zealot executioner kept a record of every man he strangled, writing only a number. When he died, the page was burned, the numbers vanished. Not all executioners chose the role. In some families, the title passed from father to son. Others were condemned criminals themselves, given the choice to kill or be killed. In 15th century Germany, one man was sentenced to hang for theft. Instead, he became the town's executioner for 27 years. He never smiled. He never missed a swing. His journal, found centuries later, simply said, "I did not choose this, but I did it cleanly." There is a strange power in this profession, not political, not moral, but primal. To take a life under law, to hold the final breath in your hands, is a weight no reward can balance. And yet, someone must do it. Someone must take the burden so that the king can sleep, so that the people can believe in justice. And so the executioner wakes again. He sharpens the blade. He binds his robe. He does not speak, and when his time comes, there may be no one left to bury him. But history will remember the silence that followed his work. Now we will look at the life of the poisoner's apprentice, a shadowed figure who mixed death by grain and goblet, trained in secrets, feared by many, and trusted by few. The room is quiet, except for the soft grinding of a pestle. A boy, no more than 12, leans over a stone mortar. He wears a linen tunic and a serious face. The light from the oil lamp flickers across the wall, casting long silhouettes of glass vials and dried herbs hanging from rafters. He is not an alchemist. He is not a healer. He is learning to kill, not with a sword, not with a spear, but with bitter roots and tasteless dust. He is the apprentice of a poisoner. In the ancient world, assassination was often a craft, not a crime. From the court intrigues of Rome to the back alleys of Han China, the use of poison was widespread, quiet, and terrifying. Kings feared it more than armies. Queens accused rivals of it. And in the shadows, the poisoners worked. But they did not work alone. They taught. And so, apprentices like this boy were drawn into the hidden world of toxins, antidotes, and deception. In Rome, poison was known as venium, a word that could mean medicine or malice, depending on its use. Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius wrote often of poisonings in the imperial court. Emperors Claudius, it is said, died from mushrooms seasoned with deadly Amanita phalloides, the death cap. Agrippina, his wife, was rumored to have orchestrated the recipe. Where did she get the knowledge? From a venefica, a female poisoner trained in the art. These women passed secrets to apprentices, what plants looked innocent but were fatal, how to distill extracts, how to mask bitterness, how to administer without detection. The apprentice learned by watching, by grinding roots, by beggaring drops. He kept quiet, he asked few questions, he wrote nothing down, and slowly he began to understand. In India, during the Mauryan Empire, the Vishakanya, or poison maidens, were said to be trained from childhood to carry trace poisons in their systems, eventually making them immune. Some were used as assassins, lovers, or spies, Whether myth or truth, the stories reflect a real tradition of courtly intrigue and toxic warfare. Apprentices were trained in compounds like aconite, datura, and opium. They learned to coat daggers, lace perfume, and soak garments in venom. They watched animals die in cages. They learned what symptoms came first: vomiting, trembling, paralysis. They practiced on condemned criminals. Some died during training. Those who survived became shadows. In China, the knowledge of poisons was also a political weapon. Emperors feared their food so much they employed food testers, tasters, and entire kitchens under surveillance. But in hidden sects and forbidden texts, poisoners trained their apprentices. They used powdered arsenic, mercury, toad skin, and herbs like gelsemium and wolfsbane. The apprentice might be tasked with watching a sparrow die to calculate dosage, writing scripts to feign a disease, crafting poison in the shape of medicine. He learned to kill slowly, over days, weeks, even years. The master would smile and say, "The slowest poisons are the hardest to prove." Not all poisoners were cruel. Some believed they served justice. They were hired to kill tyrants, punish unfaithful spouses, silence abusers. To their apprentices, they spoke of balance. The sword cuts in one moment, but the poison decides its hour. But trust was rare. Apprentices were often tested, given small doses themselves, to build tolerance or to test their loyalty. Some were killed when their masters feared betrayal. Others fled, carrying secrets no one else dared write. What did a day look like for the poisoner's apprentice? He rose before the sun. He cleaned tools with wine or vinegar, heated glass tubes, prepared antidotes first, just in case. He sorted herbs, henbane in one jar, belladonna in another, monkshood wrapped in silk. He practiced grinding evenly. He filtered liquids through linen. He might accompany his master to meet a client. He stood behind, listening. The master might say, "You wanted to sleep forever or suffer first?" The apprentice never looked up. He memorized faces, learned who came asking, who left smiling, who never returned. At night he reread ingredients by firelight. Some apprentices became obsessed, some grew pale and jittery, some kept vials under their beds just in case. They knew they would never be trusted, and they also knew everyone fears the blade they can see, no one fears the wine. They held power, quiet, deadly power. And when the master finally died, poisoned often by a rival, the apprentice lit the fire. He scattered ashes, burned records, moved to another city, changed his name. And when someone knocked late at night, whispering a request, he simply said, "What is your purpose?" And the cycle began again. Now we will look at the life of a cursed tablet scribe and tomb whisperer. The men who etched hatred into metal, spoke to the restless dead, and believed the shadows could be persuaded with ink and invocation. Night falls heavily over the necropolis. Far from the laughter of homes and the warmth of hearths, the tomb fields stretch out like a stone sea, rows of broken columns, cracked sarcophagi, and wind-worn altars. The stars peer through drifting clouds. Somewhere a dog howls, and in the darkness, beneath a twisted fig tree, a man kneels. He carries no torch, only a small iron stylus, a roll of soft light, a name. He is not a priest. He is not a sorcerer. He is a scribe of the dead, and tonight he is writing a curse. Cursing in the ancient world was not just a personal act of vengeance, it was an entire profession. From Babylon to Athens, from Rome to Carthage, people believed that writing a curse, properly, with precision and ritual, could bend reality. These curses were not shouted in the street. They were carved into lead tablets and buried in tombs, wells, or beneath arenas. They were secret weapons. Unseen daggers. The people who made them were not usually the ones who used them. They were written by curse scribes, literate men who understood the language of the underworld. They knew how to address gods of the dead, how to write names with malice, how to fold the tablets in binding shapes. They were hired in whispers, paid in coin or favor or silence. Their words were dangerous. In ancient Greece, curse tablets were called karadesmoi, binding spells. They could be used for many things: to win a court case, to ruin a rival's business, to seduce someone's lover, or to ensure an opponent failed in sport, war, or politics. The tablets were made from soft lead, easy to etch with a stylus, and heavy with symbolism. Lead was a cold, underworld metal. It did not gleam, it did not rust. It was perfect for carrying hate into the earth. The curse scribe would sit cross-legged, under torchlight, sometimes with the client beside him, sometimes alone. He would begin by binding Theodorus, son of Athanagis, his tongue, his limbs, his mind, until he cannot speak against me. Each line was carved with care, no errors allowed. Misspelled names might weaken the curse. Incorrect invocations might bring wrath instead of fortune. When finished, the tablet was folded once, twice, or tightly rolled and pierced with nails. This wasn't just for drama. The nails were symbolic. They fixed the curse, locked it in place, stabbed it into the realm of the dead. But curses needed a delivery system, and that is where the tomb whisperer came in. He was the one who carried the tablet into sacred, dangerous places: tombs, cremation pits, sacrificial altars. He did not speak loudly. He did not wear fine robes. He walked at night, carrying the lead tablets in wax cloth or bone boxes. He looked for the restless dead, those who died young or violently or without proper rites. These souls, it was believed, lingered at the edge of the underworld, eager for tasks, especially tasks soaked in vengeance. He buried the tablet with the corpse, or hid it in the jaw of a skull, or slipped it into the cracks of a tomb wall. Sometimes he whispered the name of the victim. Sometimes he poured milk or wine. Always he left quickly. The job was not just dirty, it was dangerous, because the dead were not always silent. In Roman culture, curse scribes were surprisingly common. In cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, dozens of tablets have been found beneath homes and taverns. Some were written by heartbroken lovers, others by merchants feuding over contracts. One tablet reads, "Let Quartus never find sleep until he returns what he has stolen. May his eyes burn, his tongue dry, his fingers wither." Another says, "Find Flavia's beauty, her charm, her voice, so that she may love only me and no other man." But this was not romance. This was manipulation. The scribe's role was part artistry, part performance, part priesthood. He chose the words. He crafted the symbols, often drawing snakes, skulls, or eyes. He sometimes added wax dolls, small effigies stabbed with pins or tied with string. In one site near Athens, a grave was found with 5 curse tablets and 2 clay figures, bound together, mouths sealed with lead. The scribe had given his client more than words. He had built a ritual. But how did someone become a curse scribe? Not through temples, not through official schools. Most learned from other scribes, or from old books copied by hand and hidden from view. They learned which gods to call: Hecate, goddess of the crossroads; Hermes Catonios, the underworld messenger; Persephone, queen of the silent. They learned which times were best: new moon for binding, midnight for death, eclipsed for revenge. They learned what not to do: never use your own name, never curse someone falsely, never ever open a tablet once buried. There are stories of scribes who broke these rules. One, it is said, wrote a curse in anger, then saw his own name appear in the tablet hours later, as if written by invisible hands. He buried it anyway. 3 days later, he died. The tomb whisperer's life was equally grim. He slept by day, walked by night. He wore dark robes, carried a bone charm around his neck, and never crossed the same grave twice. Children threw stones at him, priests warned him to stay clear of altars, but when someone needed a curse delivered, they found him, always. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with calm. Do you want him ruined, or just frightened? Do you want her to love you or hate everyone else? He charged based on risk. Buried near the tomb of a child? Expensive, but effective. Slipping a tablet into a judge's home? Almost impossible, double price. He asked no questions about why, only about how badly. Not every curse worked, but some seemed to. There are records of trials where the accused began trembling before speaking, of merchants who lost everything overnight, of lovers who returned, eyes blank and obedient. Coincidence? Or curse? Then the scribe never claimed credit. The tomb whisperer never asked, but both of them knew. They knew that words carry weight, that hate, when buried in sacred ground, sometimes grows roots, and that the dead, when spoken to properly, sometimes listen. Now the night is fading. The tomb whisperer rises from his knees, covers the newly disturbed soil, and walks away, silently, steadily, without looking back. Behind him, the lead tablet lies coiled in the dark, a name etched in anger, a wish soaked in shadow, a hope that the gods below are listening. Now we will look at the life of the sacred prostitute, a figure caught between worship and exploitation, who served gods with their body and bore the burdens of both reverence and ruin. The temple courtyard is quiet beneath the dusk. Torches flicker in bronze holders along the walls. The scent of rose water and frankincense clings to the air. The pillars are smooth and cool, polished by generations of hands. Sandals patter softly on the stone. And behind the silken curtain, a woman waits. She is not a concubine. She is not a dancer. She is a sacred servant of the goddess, a Neditu in Babylon, a Devadasi in India, a temple courtesan in Greece. If she was trained not in war, nor in trade, but in worship, through ritual, recitation, beauty, and the body. And tonight, as the offering drums begin to sound, her role begins. Throughout the ancient world, sexuality and sanctity were not always enemies. In some cultures, they were entwined, threads of a divine tapestry woven through myths, fertility rites, and temple service. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, ruled love and war, beauty and power. Her temples were places of ritual sex where women and sometimes men served, not as outcasts, but as instruments of worship. The rites were older than writing. Before the laws of Hammurabi, before the Epic of Gilgamesh, there were ceremonies in Uruk where high priestesses enacted the sacred marriage between goddess and king. The priestess was believed to channel the goddess herself. But not all temple servants were priestesses. Some were girls, offered by families to the temple at a young age. Others were orphan slaves or daughters of debtors. They were given fine clothes, perfumed oils, and education. They were taught music, poetry, ritual gesture. They were prepared for sacred intimacy. It was called hieros gamos, holy union. But while the priests called it divine, many of the women called it something else in the privacy of their hearts. Duty. In Greece, courtesans known as hetairai were a class apart, intelligent, trained, able to attend male-only symposia, and sometimes tied to temples of Aphrodite. These women were not prostitutes in the street. They could converse in philosophy, recite Homer, and advise politicians. But their services were not free, and while some wielded quiet influence, most lived on the edge of respectability. To the outside world, they were admired and shunned. To the men who visited them, they were confession, comfort, and distraction. Of themselves, it depended. One hetera, Neaira, was put on trial in 4th century Athens for allegedly marrying a citizen, a crime for foreigners. Her past was dragged through the court, Her words were not recorded, but her name was. Not all sacred prostitutes were nameless, but their stories often were. In ancient India, the Devadasi tradition tied young girls to temples, particularly those of Shiva and Krishna. These girls, sometimes as young as 5, were dedicated by families, some out of devotion, others out of poverty. They were married not to men, but to the deity. Their lives became performance ritual dances, offerings, morning songs. They were trained in classical arts, adorned in silks, honored by kings. But behind the golden garlands, many were also expected to offer sexual services to priests, patrons, or temple officials. And though the tradition began with worship, it gradually blurred into exploitation. By the medieval period, many Devadasis lived in semi-servitude. They could not marry. Their children were often illegitimate. And while temples flourished on their labor, they were rarely allowed property or freedom. Some resisted. Some accepted. Some wrote poetry in secret, speaking only to the gods. In Egypt, temple service was different but no less complicated. Priestesses of Hathor, goddess of love and music, were trained in sensual rites. Music, dance, and intoxication were part of the divine experience. Rituals involving fertility and rebirth were central to Egyptian belief. While not all temple women were involved in sacred sex, some rituals, particularly those linked to Osiris and fertility myths, involved symbolic reenactments. It is hard to separate myth from fact, but what is clear is that women's bodies were often used as vessels for divine expression. But not all sacred sex workers were women. In certain temples, particularly those linked to Ishtar or Cybele, male priests, known as Gali or sacred eunuchs, participated in rituals of gender inversion. Some castrated themselves in service to the goddess. They wore feminine clothing, danced in ecstatic frenzies, and performed rites of fertility and mourning. Their roles were often both revered and reviled. They walked between worlds, not fully male, not fully female, not fully accepted, but always watching, always carrying the burden of sanctity and spectacle. Societies evolve, temples fall, empires forget, but the traces remain in dusty scrolls, in ruined altars, in the faded outlines of footpaths leading to chambers where songs once rose with the dawn, and in the silence left behind by those who gave so much and asked so little. She sleeps now, the sacred prostitute, alone in her chamber, lit only by the ember of a lamp, her mind still reciting fragments of prayer. She does not dream of love, only of cool water, and silence, and somewhere, far beyond the stone and incense, the gods she served remain silent too. Now we will turn our gaze to a job as grim as it was common, a profession performed in full view of the public, surrounded by cries of pain and plumes of dust, often soaked in sweat, blood, and superstition. In the bustling marketplaces and crooked alleys of medieval Europe, before the rise of formal medicine and dentistry, there existed a figure both feared and sought after: the teeth puller. This was not dentistry as we know it. There were no clean chairs, no numbing gels, no sterilized metal tools. There were no careful x-rays, no fine porcelain caps or veneers. There was only the agonizing judgment of pain and decay, and the swift, brutal solution that followed. The medieval teeth puller was equal parts performer, healer, and butcher. In medieval towns, especially during fairs, the arrival of a tooth puller was no small event. Some were itinerants who traveled from village to village, pulling teeth in public squares amid shouts and laughter. Others were part of local guilds, lumped in with barbers, bathhouse attendants, or even executioners. Men who understood how flesh parted and how bone cracked. They would set up a small stage or operate from a stall adorned with strange tools and jars. Behind them, a row of extracted teeth, often nailed to wood or displayed like trophies, gave passers-by a grim idea of what was to come. In their pockets were coins, in their hands cruel iron pliers, and in their gaze a practiced steadiness. There were no licensing boards or formal apprenticeships for these men. Their authority came from boldness, stories, and sometimes superstition. Many advertised themselves as miracle workers or alchemists. Others wore gaudy robes, dramatic hats, and carried symbols of the apothecary trade to lend an air of mystery. But there was nothing mysterious about their main act. Dental pain in the Middle Ages was not just an inconvenience, it was unbearable. Without antibiotics, infections ran wild. A rotting molar might swell a man's jaw until it closed his throat. A festering gum could become a fatal abscess. Decay was rampant, especially among the rich who consumed more sugar and wine. Poor peasants, with their coarse bread and acidic gruel, fared little better. Toothache was often described in spiritual terms as punishment, possession, or demonic affliction. Remedies ranged from the herbal to the insane, applying ashes of burned toads, kissing a donkey's mouth, placing crushed onions behind the ear, or whispering prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of tooth pain. But when prayers failed, the only option left was the tooth puller. He didn't ask questions, he didn't bother with diagnosis. He yanked the offending tooth, often with violence, speed, and showmanship. The medieval teeth puller's toolkit was small but fearsome. Most notable was the dental pelican, named for its resemblance to a bird's beak. It was a levered instrument designed to hook around the tooth and force it from the jaw. Misused, as it often was, it could snap teeth in half, shatter roots, or dislocate jaws. Later came the dental key, a twisted, wrench-like device that gripped the tooth and rotated it out. These were used well into the 18th century, often causing more damage than relief. Some pullers used simple tongs or pliers akin to those used by blacksmiths. Others had thin iron rods to wedge between teeth and gums. There were no gloves, no alcohol rubs, no sanitation. Pain was a constant. Some tooth pullers offered a drink of alcohol beforehand. Others preferred their patients to be sober so they didn't faint too easily or vomit during the show. If the patient struggled, assistants held them down or tied them to a post. The sound of a tooth cracking free, the rush of blood, and the scream that followed, these were all part of the performance. You might think people avoided this gruesome scene. In truth, it drew crowds. In Paris, London, and Florence, tooth pulling was a public spectacle, often performed during festivals. A puller might pay a town crier to announce his services. He'd stand on a platform, beckoning with a silver tooth or dangling a necklace of molars. "Step forward," he'd cry, "and I shall pull the devil from your jaw." The audience watched eagerly. Some laughed at the pain, others winced, recalling their own future in that chair. The tooth puller played to the crowd, waving bloody forceps in the air, showing off the extracted tooth, sometimes tossing it into the dirt. In rural fairs, he might compete with jugglers, fire eaters, or puppet shows. His act was grotesque, yes, but it served a need. And for many, it worked. Crude as they were, these extractions often brought genuine relief. Though, of course, there were many who did not survive. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, the real danger came after the tooth was removed. A careless puller might tear flesh or leave the root behind. Infections could set in within days, fever, pus, swelling, and eventually septicemia. If the tooth was linked to a deeper abscess, disturbing it could spread infection to the brain or bloodstream. Survivors were often left with broken teeth, crooked jaws, or lifelong pain. And yet, people came back, again and again. Because tooth pain in the Middle Ages was unrelenting. People would do anything to end it, even if it meant risking death. The puller didn't guarantee healing, he only promised immediate relief. Whether that relief lasted was not his concern. Many teeth pullers were nomadic, quacks, con men, or half-trained barbers who performed under many titles. Some called themselves surgeons, others claimed to have studied in Italy or to possess secret remedies from Arabia. They wore robes covered in mystical symbols and muttered prayers in Latin, sometimes backwards, to impress the illiterate. Some even sold powders and potions, ground coral for bleeding gums, vinegar-soaked bark for toothaches, or elixirs of hardening that promised to strengthen the enamel. These men blurred the line between medicine and magic. Some were genuine in their intent, others were pure opportunists. But all of them traded in the same currency: hope, born of desperation. While most teeth pullers were men, there are records of women practicing tooth removal, especially in convents or among midwives. In quieter corners of society, older women used herbs and patience to numb gums before pulling teeth. They had no tools, just cloth, thread, and determination. Their work was less public, less celebrated, but often more careful. Some even used honey or rosemary oil to soothe the wound afterward. But they lacked the bravado of their male counterparts and rarely earned more than a few coins or thanks. In this brutal world, gentleness didn't draw crowds. By the 17th century, more regulated forms of dentistry began to emerge. Guilds formalized, books were written, and surgical techniques refined. But the image of the medieval tooth puller, the man on the wooden stage waving his iron tongs, pulling molars in bloodied sleeves, never quite faded. In old paintings and woodcuts, he appears with wide eyes, crooked teeth, and tools hanging from his belt like weapons. Sometimes he's seen triumphantly holding a tooth to the sky. Other times, a patient lies limp beside him. He is history's reminder that medicine was once performance, that healing once required spectacle, and that even something as small as a tooth could become a stage for suffering and survival. Now we will look at the life of the corpse washer and plague cleaner, the men and women whose hands prepared the dead for the afterlife, even as death lingered in the air around them. The sun is not yet risen, but already the stench of sickness rides the wind. In the alleys of Cairo, the bodies lie still, wrapped in linen, covered in dust. Some are curled on doorsteps, some on wooden boards, others on bare earth. The city is hushed, not in peace, but in dread. Footsteps echo softly in the street. The man approaches, flanked by two boys. He carries a basin, a jug of water, and a roll of clean cloth. The boys carry oils and wrapped reeds. Their faces are tight, not with fear, but with focus. They are ghasals, corpse washers. Their duty is simple: cleanse the dead. Their burden is enormous: do so without succumbing to death themselves. In many ancient and medieval societies, preparing a body for burial was not left to family or priests alone. It was done by trained individuals who understood the rights, the risks, and the responsibility. They were known by many names: Geshel in the Islamic world, Chevra Kadisha in Jewish tradition, Thanato Praktai in ancient Greece, Tsogishi in Japan, and in times of plague, simply cleaners. But whether it was a peaceful death or a blackened corpse during an outbreak, the duty remained. They touched the untouchable. They honored the lifeless. They stood between grief and rot. In Islamic culture, washing the dead was a spiritual obligation. The Ghusl al-Mayit, ritual washing of the deceased, was performed with deep respect and precision. Water was warmed, the body laid on a wooden board, the face turned toward Mecca. Men washed men, women washed women. Children were handled gently, often by elderly members of the community. But during epidemics, this custom became a crucible. In the 14th century, when the Black Death reached the Middle East, tens of thousands died in weeks. Cities like Aleppo, Baghdad, and Jerusalem were overwhelmed. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. And still, the ghasls came. Wearing cloth soaked in vinegar, breathing through wool, hands wrapped in linen. They washed the corpses of neighbors, friends, strangers. They did not stop, even as some of them began to cough, even as their own sons and wives fell ill. In Jewish tradition, the body was washed by the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society. They worked in silence. They recited psalms. They never turned away in disgust, no matter the state of the body. They believed every corpse must be buried intact, with dignity, even if it had been burned, crushed, or left to decay. They cleaned every finger, combed every strand of hair. And when plague struck Europe, they continued, even when towns blamed them, even when their own were buried alongside others. They honored the dead until they joined them. In ancient Greece, corpse washing was both duty and danger. The dead were seen as polluted, miasma, and their unburied presence could offend the gods. So the thanatopracti, death workers, stepped in. They washed the body with wine or salt. He anointed it with oil, wrapped it in fine linen. Sometimes they performed procesius, the laying out of the body for mourners to view. But they were not priests. They were rarely wealthy, and though their work was essential, they were avoided in public. Death clung to them, even in life. In feudal Japan, corpse preparation fell to outcast communities, the Budokumen, who also handled animal slaughter and waste disposal. They lived on the margins, but their knowledge of body handling, decomposition, and disease was unmatched. When smallpox or cholera swept through towns, these workers were first to arrive, last to leave. They burned infected garments, dug mass graves, washed what could be saved, prayed where others dared not tread. Their reward? Silence, stigma, but sometimes a quiet gratitude from those who lived. During the Black Death in Europe, corpse cleaners became a desperate essential class. They wore beaked masks, not for drama, but for defense. The long noses were stuffed with herbs like mint, rose petals, and cloves, thought to purify the air. They carried sticks not just for balance, but to turn bodies without touching. They shoveled, scrubbed, buried, burned. Cities like Florence, London, and Paris could not function without them. And yet they were never named in the chronicles. They died by the thousand. Only the living were remembered. What did a day look like for a corpse washer? It began with prayer. Not always religious, sometimes whispered to the air, to whatever spirit might be listening. They gathered water, heated if possible. They unwrapped the corpse, sometimes days old, sometimes still warm. They washed gently, first the face, then the hands, then the rest. They used cloth, not bare hands. They avoided cuts, sores, fluids. If the dead had died of plague, they worked fast. No ceremony, care. They recited names when known. When unknown, they said, "Child of Earth, return in peace." Many became numb. Others found meaning in the repetition. A few wrote journals, mostly lost, but fragments survive. I washed 17 today, I do not feel my fingers. I dream of quiet water. They say I will die next. I am ready. But tomorrow, there are still more. I wept for a girl with her doll still tied to her wrist. I wept when I was alone. What kind of person became a corpse washer? Some were pious. Some were desperate. Some had no choice. Born into families that always buried the town, but all shared one thing: a tolerance for death. Not love of it, not obsession, but just the calm, steady courage to face what others fled. The washer does not brag. He does not speak of his work at market. He does not dine in the houses of the healthy. He eats alone, sleeps lightly, wakes early, because death is always early. And yet, the work brings peace. The dead deserve dignity. They deserve to leave this world clean. And the washer ensures they do. Not as a hero, not for gold, but because someone must. And so, in the silent corners of plague-struck towns, in the tombs of temples, and beneath the flickering lamps of ancient cities, the corpse washer dips the cloth once more, wipes the final trace of earth from a cheek, closes the eyelids, holds the hands, and whispers, "Go in peace, you are not alone." Now we will look at the life of the battlefield corpse scavenger, a figure who emerged after the chaos of war, walking among the fallen not to mourn or honor, but to collect, strip, and sell the remains of battle. The morning after battle is a silence like no other. The cries have ceased. The horns have stopped. The wind moves slowly over a field now littered with bodies. Armor twisted, limbs torn, banners torn down into rags. And into this desolation walks a man with a cart. He is not a soldier. He wears no colors. He carries no weapon but a short blade and a set of iron tongs. He is a corpse scavenger. And where others see horror, he sees opportunity. Throughout ancient and medieval history, war left behind more than stories. It left fields strewn with armor, coin, rings, daggers, and teeth of the dead. In the wake of conflict, when armies marched away or buried their honored dead, these scavengers came quietly. They were peasants, outlaws, desperate men. Some worked alone, others in groups. They followed the drums of war, but from a distance, waiting, watching, and when the sun rose on victory or slaughter, they moved in. In ancient Rome, these scavengers were known to pick through the aftermath of major battles like Cannae or Pharsalus. Their goals were simple: strip the armor, take the weapons, pull rings and pendants, extract gold teeth, collect arrows and javelins for resale. They worked fast. Time was not on their side. The army might return. The vultures would soon descend. Or worse, the wounded might rise. So they moved like shadows, unseen, silent. In medieval Europe, they were called pilferers or ravens. After the Battle of Agincourt, after Crécy, after Falkirk, the fields became markets of the dead. And these men arrived with carts and cloth sacks. Some were sanctioned by kings, allowed to take gear from enemy corpses as payment for digging mass graves. Others were hunted if caught, because stealing from the dead, though common, was seen as a sin, a violation. Yet everyone knew they existed, and some quietly paid them. What did a day look like for the battlefield scavenger? He arrived late, always late. Never during the fighting. Not when the swords still rang. He waited until the banners had moved on, until the fog of blood had settled. Then he moved forward. He wore gloves. He carried a sharp blade for cutting, buckles and belts. He had pliers for teeth. He started at the outer edges. The lonely dead. The forgotten spearmen. He cut rings from fingers, sometimes from bone. He broke sword hilts to sell the pommel. He scraped dried blood off shields, and always he checked the boots. Soldiers hid coins in them, or knives, or keepsakes. Some had letters, tokens, lockets. He read none of them. He sold everything. If he found the dying, he walked past. He was not a healer. If he found priests, he waited. If he found dogs, he scared them off. He was not brave, but he was needed. Armies did not clean their messes. He did. In many battles, especially in winter, the dead froze quickly. The scavenger had to thaw armor off bodies. He would build small fires nearby, melt the ice. Sometimes he found entire chests of loot, sometimes just lice and torn flesh. He had no expectation, only hope. In Japan, after the battles of the Sengoku period, scavengers walked the mountain passes after the samurai clashed. They carried long bamboo poles with hooks, used them to turn corpses over. They removed the lacquered armor, often still sticky with blood. They collected arrows and sword fragments. They cut off top knots to sell to rival clans. Proof of death. The scavenger never stayed long. Disease followed the dead. He washed in stream, burned his clothes. He never told people what he did, only that he had goods. From a distant source. Sometimes he was robbed, and sometimes he was beaten. Sometimes he stumbled across buried treasure. One scavenger in 15th century France was said to have found a knight's burial vault, looted it, and disappeared with more silver than he could carry. Another died from wounds while trying to pry open a sealed helmet. The job gave nothing back, only scars, only nightmares. But for some, it was the only work available. After all, who else would touch the fallen? Who else would risk infection, ghosts, and blades left half buried? Not the priests, not the nobles, and only the scavenger. He lived on the edge of towns. His neighbors did not speak to him, but when war came near, they watched him more closely. They knew. He would walk the field. He would carry the weight. and he would never look back. Now we will look at the life of the bloodletter and leech collector, those who drained disease from the body not with potions or prayers, but with knives, heat, and the slow, cold mouths of tiny worms. The room is dim, and the walls are lined with glass jars. Some hold dried herbs, some hold folded cloth, and one, the most carefully guarded, holds a mass of slick, wriggling leeches, black and brown, clinging to the inside like hungry infants. At the center of the room sits a chair of carved oak, stained from years of use. Beside it, a young boy tightens a cloth band around a man's arm. His hands shake slightly, but his eyes are steady. He is learning the craft of the bloodletter, and today the knife is his responsibility. For thousands of years, from Egypt to Greece, Rome to Baghdad, Paris to London, one idea shaped medicine. Illness was an imbalance. The body, people believed, was filled with 4 essential fluids: humors, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. When these were out of harmony, sickness followed. Fever, too much blood. Melancholy, too much black bile. Madness, perhaps the blood had risen to the head. And so the cure was simple: drain the excess. The body, they thought, needed purging, and for this they turned to the bloodletter. In medieval Europe, many bloodletters were barber surgeons, a strange blend of groomer and healer. You could get a haircut, a tooth pulled, and a vein opened all in the same visit. The symbol of their trade, the red and white barber pole, actually comes from this practice. The red represented blood, the white the bandages. Some shops even hung the actual blood-soaked cloths outside their doors. The tools were primitive, but they were handled with ceremony. A brass or iron lancet, curved for precision, bowls of varying size to measure the blood, clean cloths, sometimes boiled in vinegar, a hot cup in case suction was needed, and of course the leeches. The apprentice's job was not just to prepare the patient, but to soothe them. He would tie the tourniquet, sterilize the lancet over flame, hold the bowl steady, and calm the patient's trembling hands. He also fetched the leeches when required from the cold storage jar, or if freshly caught, from a small wooden cage where they clung like living ribbons. But who caught the leeches? The leech collector was an entirely different profession, and perhaps even more miserable. These men, often peasants or ex-convicts, earned their living by wading waist-deep into stagnant marshes, bogs, or riverbanks. Their method was both brutal and effective. They would strip to their underclothes, wrap coarse cloth around their legs, and walk slowly through leech-infested waters, letting the creatures latch onto their skin. Once the leeches were engorged with blood and heavy enough, the collector would pull them off, one by one, and drop them into clay jars filled with water and bits of moss. It was dangerous work. Leeches could cause infection. Some carried bacteria. The wounds bled for hours. Many collectors suffered from anemia, exhaustion, or open sores that never truly healed. But there was money in the misery. A jar of strong, fat leeches could fetch a good price in the city, especially in times of plague or fever outbreaks. Physicians and barbers competed for the freshest stock. The procedure itself varied depending on the region and affliction. In Islamic medicine, especially during the Golden Age in the Abbasid Caliphate, bloodletting, called hijama, was practiced with more care and ritual. Heated cups were used to create suction on the skin before making small incisions. The bad blood was drawn out through pressure rather than slicing, and it was often combined with massage and herbal remedies. In China, a similar technique existed, though cupping was used more for energy flow than blood balance. In Europe, however, the practice could be far more brutal. The bloodletter might drain 8 to 16 ounces at once, sometimes more. This could leave the patient weak, dizzy, or even unconscious. It was not uncommon for people to vomit or faint during the procedure. Still, it was prescribed for nearly everything: headaches, fevers, gout, menstrual issues, insomnia, beheadedness, even spiritual afflictions. The belief ran deep: if you were ill, there was too much inside you, and it had to come out. One of the strangest facts about bloodletting is how long it survived. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, doctors in Europe and America continued to bleed patients. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was reportedly drained of over 40% of his blood over 2 days while being treated for a sore throat. He died, and many historians believe the treatment contributed more to his death than the illness itself. But back in the medieval world, none of this was questioned. To the poor, the bloodletter was a last hope. To the rich, he was a professional. To his apprentice, he was a teacher, a mentor, a man with red hands and quiet eyes. The apprentice had to learn not just medicine, but mood. He memorized where the veins were closest to the surface: the median cubital vein in the arm, the dorsal venous network of the hand, the saphenous vein of the leg. He learned to time the cuts, to watch the patient's lips, to count their breath, to stop before the shivering began. He also learned the personalities of leeches. Some clung too tight and left ulcers. Some refused to bite unless wormed. Others detached early and crawled away. The best were reused, carefully washed in brine, and stored for another day. The worst were burned. Superstition claimed they could crawl into the soul if mishandled. But the job was not without fear. Bloodletters were often blamed for deaths, especially when patients worsened after a session. They were accused of witchcraft or incompetence. They were forced to flee towns, or worse, punished by the church. Still, the demand never ceased. Wars brought wounds. Winters brought coughs. Famine brought fever. And always the bloodletter came with bowl and blade. In one town in Bohemia, the bloodletter kept a journal. He wrote, "I have opened the same vein 20 times in a single woman. She says her thoughts are darker now, but her joints ache less. I do not know what to think of this. I pray while I cut." Another, in Andalusia, wrote, "The boy brings leeches from the market. I fear he has named them. It is better if we do not name them." In the East, a Persian physician noted, "A man who loses blood is softened, his speech, his strength, even his anger. There is a lesson in this." And what of the apprentice? Many never advanced. They remained assistants, cleaners, watchers. But a few, through years of discipline, took up the lancet themselves. They opened veins, calmed the sick, passed the knowledge forward. They became the quiet engineers of ancient medicine, misguided perhaps, but sincere. And when their work was done, they sat in the same chair, cleaned the same blade, whispered the same promise. "You will feel better, the sickness is leaving. Now we will look at the life of the gong farmer and the medieval latrine diver, those who descended into the filth of castles and cities, whose work stank, stained, and scarred, yet who were essential to the survival of civilization. They worked in darkness, they worked in silence, and they worked alone. No noble knew their names. No priest blessed their tools. No songs were written for them. But without them, cities would drown in their own waste. It is just past midnight. The taverns have emptied, the streets are quiet, save for the shuffle of rats and the distant bark of a guard dog. In a narrow alley, a man pushes a wooden cart on iron-rimmed wheels. The cart creaks with every jolt over cobblestone. His clothes are thick with grease and dirt, his face wrapped in a cloth that barely masks the stench. On his belt hangs a small spade, a hook, and a rope. He reaches the edge of a public privy. It is nothing more than a hole in the earth, stone-lined, deep, and very, very full. By lantern light, he ties the rope around his waist, secures the hook to the beam above, and lowers himself slowly into the darkness below. He is a gong farmer, and this is his job. The name gong farmer comes from the Old English word gang, meaning to go, particularly to relieve oneself. So, a gong farmer was, in medieval England, especially in cities like London or York, outhouses and public toilets were often connected to deep cesspits. These pits could extend several meters underground and would fill over the years with a mixture of feces, urine, straw, kitchen waste, and rainwater. Once the pits were full, they needed to be emptied. and this task fell to the gong farm. It was a job few wanted. It was a job many mocked, but it was necessary, because in a crowded city without sewers, if no one emptied the cesspits, disease would spread, rats would multiply, streets would flood with filth. In France, these workers were called fossoyeurs or vidangeurs, cesspool clearers. In Germany, Abtreiniger. In the Islamic world, night soil collectors often worked near bathhouses and latrines, though in some cities they were replaced by more elaborate underground channels called qanats. But wherever humans lived in density, the result was the same. Waste accumulated, and someone had to deal with it. The work began at night, usually after midnight when the streets were empty. A team of 2 or 3 gong farmers would arrive at a designated pit, usually behind a tavern, near a market, or within the courtyard of a castle. One man, often the most experienced, would lower himself into the pit using ropes or ladders. In the pitch black, he would scoop the waste into leather buckets or wooden pails, which his partners would haul up one by one. They wore thick boots, wrapped their faces in cloth soaked with vinegar, sometimes stuffed herbs in their noses to block the smell, but nothing could truly mask the odor. The pit was alive, not just with waste, but with maggots, cockroaches, and rodents. The fumes could cause fainting. The gases, if disturbed too quickly, could ignite if a lantern was brought too close. More than one gong farmer collapsed at the bottom of a pit and never rose again. The waste, politely referred to as night soil, was loaded onto carts and hauled outside the city walls. There, it was dumped into open fields or mixed with straw and sold as fertilizer to farmers. In some cases, it was buried in massive pits lined with lime. The cycle repeated every night. By dawn, the gun farmers were gone. The streets were clean, and no one asked questions. In castles, the work could be even more precarious. Medieval castles often had garderobes, toilet chutes built into the outer walls that dropped waste directly into moats or small catch basins below. These basins had to be cleared, and the only way to do so was by crawling into the narrow space, scraping the filth into buckets, and passing them out one at a time. The man who did this was known as a latrine diver. He worked crouched or even lying on his side. The smell was suffocating, the stone walls slick, the air barely breathable. And still he worked, because if the basins overflowed, the waste would back up into the castle itself, into the kitchens, into the halls, into the living spaces of lords and ladies. No one wanted to see the latrine diver, but everyone needed him. The pay for gong farmers was surprisingly better than many other laborers. Because the job was so filthy, dangerous, and socially degrading, many cities offered generous wages. In some cases, the equivalent of a skilled craftsman. They were often allowed to live outside the city walls, where they had space to dump and dry waste. But they were also socially shunned, forbidden from eating in common taverns, barred from public festivals, and discouraged from marriage into clean families. Their children, too, inherited the shame. Even though they served the city, saved it in many ways, they were treated like ghosts. The apprentice to a gong farmer had to learn not just how to shovel, but how to survive. He was taught how to lower buckets without tipping, how to breathe slowly in the pit, how to spot gas pockets in the muck, how to fight off rats, how to climb slick ladders with one hand. He learned that silence was better than talk, that bathing had to be thorough, that vinegar and salt could mask things others couldn't bear. He also learned when to run, when the pit collapsed, or when people came throwing stones and curses. In some cases, gong farmers developed strange wisdom. They could tell what a family ate by the contents of their privy. They could trace illness by changes in smell and texture. They could sometimes predict famine when stools grew watery and thin across the city. They were, unknowingly, proto-epidemiologists. But no one listened. One recorded story tells of a gong farmer in 14th century York who warned the city council that multiple pits near the main square were swelling with plague. He begged them to allow his team to dig them out early. They refused. 3 months later, over 300 people died in the same quarter. The farmer survived, but he never spoke publicly again. What did the end of a shift look like? The men burned their clothes. They washed in rivers or at special bathhouses. They prayed, if they still believed. They fell asleep away from others, not from shame, but to spare them the smell. And yet they returned, night after night, because someone had to carry the waste away. Someone had to keep the streets dry, the privies empty, the moats from rising. Not the kings, not the knights, not the priests, the gong farmers, the latrine divers, the forgotten, the filth bearers, the silent guardians of sanitation, and in their own way, heroes of the night. Now we will turn to the riverbanks of ancient Egypt, where a strange, sacred duty brought men face to face with one of the Nile's most feared creatures. In the steaming marshes and temple courtyards of cities like Crocodilopolis, a job existed that combined danger, ritual, and devotion. It was the duty of the crocodile feeder, a temple servant who risked his life to care for, worship, and sometimes even entertain crocodiles believed to be divine. These men walked the edge of myth and mortality every day. To most Egyptians, the crocodile was a beast of terror, a sudden snap in the reeds, a swirl of blood in muddy water. But to others, especially in parts of Upper Egypt, the crocodile was not a monster. It was a god, and that god had to be fed. In Egyptian belief, Sobek, the crocodile-headed god, was a powerful and ambiguous deity. He embodied strength, virility, fertility, and the might of the Nile itself. Sobek was protector and predator, worshipped in regions where crocodiles were abundant. His temples housed live, sacred crocodiles, sometimes wearing jewelry, living in stone pools, fed daily with offerings of meat, fish, and sometimes more exotic treats. The men chosen to care for these creatures were not ordinary laborers. They were ritual specialists, often born into temple families or trained in the rites of Sobek's cult. They were respected, but also pitied, for their task was dangerous, filthy, and unending. Imagine waking before sunrise and walking barefoot into a stone courtyard, where a 12-foot-long crocodile lies still, its eyes barely open, nostrils twitching at your scent. You carry a basket of raw meat, fish, bird, maybe a chunk of donkey if the temple was wealthy that day. Your job is to approach the creature, call to it using temple chants, and place the food close enough that it will eat, but not so close that it lunges. And crocodiles did lunge. Many feeders lost fingers, hands, or worse. Records speak of priests with missing limbs, healed scars, or permanent limps. If a feeder was devoured, it was said to be an honor, a kind of holy sacrifice. Some even believe the crocodile had absorbed the man's essence. But not everyone in Egypt worshipped Sobek. To many, these rituals seemed perverse. In some cities, crocodiles were hunted, killed, and displayed as warnings. But in the sacred zones of Sobek's power, the crocodile was bathed in perfumes, fed delicacies, and adorned with gold earrings. In Fayum, the city that the Greeks later called Crocodilopolis, a great temple housed the most famous sacred crocodile of all, Petsuchos. He was said to live in a special pool lined with marble with a ramp leading to a sunning platform. He wore bracelets of gold and semi-precious stones. His pool was cleaned regularly by temple attendants. Offerings were floated to him on wooden rafts, sometimes prepared by the feeders, sometimes by wealthy patrons who sought Sobek's favor. Feeding Petsuchos was more than a chore. It was a public act of devotion. Pilgrims would gather in the courtyard to watch the sacred meal. Some threw coins into the pool, others whispered prayers or chanted hymns. The feeder was part priest, part animal handler, part performer. His every move had to be exact. Too slow, and the crocodile grew agitated. Too fast, and the priest risked losing his arm. There were rules. One never turned their back on Sobek. One never bled in the sacred courtyard. One always bowed before placing the meat. And still, injuries occurred. The feeders knew fear intimately. They knew the feel of a crocodile's tail whipping across their shins. They knew the way temple floors grew slick with water and blood. They knew the sound of the creature's jaws snapping shut, the dull, final crack of bone. Feeding crocodiles also meant feeding the mummified ones. Not all Sobek temples had live crocodiles. Some had dozens, even hundreds, of preserved crocodile mummies stacked in underground vaults. These creatures were raised or caught specifically for ritual death. Their bodies were carefully embalmed, their mouths stuffed with resin, their bodies wrapped in linen. Some were tiny hatchlings mummified in groups. Others were full-grown adults, and it was the feeder's job, or one like him, to help prepare them. Crocodile farms existed in these temple estates. The priests would collect eggs, raise hatchlings, and sacrifice them at specific ages. This act was both holy and profitable. Pilgrims bought these mummies to offer to Sobek, hoping to curry divine favor. So a crocodile feeder might begin his day cleaning a marble pool, feeding a living god beast, and end it preparing a juvenile crocodile for death. The job was soaked in contradiction, care and violence, reverence and fear. Some feeders became deeply bonded with their crocodiles. One Greek traveler, Herodotus, described how the sacred crocodiles would come when called, take food gently from hand, and allow themselves to be petted or even massaged. But this was not always the case. Not all crocodiles behaved. Some had to be coaxed with incense, others lashed out without warning, some grew too large or too aggressive and were quietly replaced. Rumors existed of feeders who were sacrificed deliberately, offered up in rituals during times of famine or plague, because in hard times, Sobek's hunger could be symbolic. To feed the crocodile was to acknowledge the fragile bargain between man and nature. It meant honoring the forces that fed the Nile, but could also drown a village. Sobek was fertility, but also chaos, and to serve him was to dwell daily on that edge. The lives of crocodile feeders were short in many cases. Those who grew old did so because they were careful, cautious, and devout. They passed down their techniques orally, chants to soothe the beast, how to clean a bite wound with vinegar and salt, how to walk sideways like a crab to avoid startling the animal. Some had apprentices, young boys who cleaned the pool, fetched the meat, and learned the way of the reed-shrouded enclosures. These boys watched, year after year, until it was their turn to step forward. Meat in hand, heart pounding, praying not to be devoured. In modern times, archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions and murals depicting crocodile rituals. Some show priests with offerings, others depict Sobek receiving blessings from the pharaoh himself. In tombs, models of crocodiles have been found, placed next to miniature pools and tiny figures of feeders with tools. These depictions preserve the memory of one of Egypt's strangest professions, a job rooted in faith, survival, and a daily flirtation with death. The crocodile feeder did not seek glory. He lived in the shadows of temple walls and stalked the misty edges of canals. His job was sacred and cursed and unforgettable. He was the caretaker of a god with teeth. Now we will travel eastward, across the dusty plains and monsoon-soaked jungles of ancient India, to the great cities of the Mauryan Empire, one of the most powerful realms of the ancient world. Here, under emperors like Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka the Great, armies marched, edicts were carved into stone, and towering palaces stretched over busy cities like Pataliputra. And beside all this magnificence, in a sprawling sector near the city walls, was a place most avoided, the elephant stables. Loud, filthy, thunderous home to the empire's war beasts and the forgotten men who served them. Among these was a caste of laborers rarely mentioned in scrolls or poetry, the elephant stable cleaners. The Mauryans revered elephants. They were not just animals, they were symbols of divine power, of royal dignity, of strength unmatched. On the battlefield, they were the tanks of their day, unstoppable, armored giants that crushed men, horses, and walls. In temples, they were sacred beings, sometimes associated with gods like Ganesha, the remover of obstacles. In royal processions, they carried banners and bells, painted with ochre and gold. But before any of that display, before the bells, the jewels, the trumpeting glory, someone had to clean up what the elephants left behind. And that someone lived in the shadows of the empire. Imagine the scale first. A full-grown Indian elephant produces nearly 150 kilograms of dung per day, steaming, fibrous, swarming with flies. Add to this the gallons of urine, the rotting fodder, the chaff from sugarcane, the broken chains, and the sheer noise and danger of being so near to creatures that could crush you with one misstep. Now imagine doing this work barefoot. The cleaners, often young men from lower castes or outcast communities, worked in long shifts, hauling baskets of dung across muddy, urine-soaked floors. Their tools were primitive: wide baskets woven from palm fronds, hooked poles for moving waste, cloths to wipe stone, and sometimes nothing but their hands. There were no gloves, no soap, no relief from the stench. Some used river water to wash themselves, but most were resigned to the permanent stink of elephant waste in their hair and skin. In the heat of summer, the stables became ovens, the air thick, buzzing with flies. In the monsoon, they flooded, and the dung turned to soup. Yet the work had to be done. Elephants were prized possessions. If they fell ill from dirty surroundings, it was the stablemen, not the nobles, who paid the price. Reports suggest stable workers were whipped or fined for letting floors go uncleared, for letting fodder spoil, or for failing to notice signs of infection. Many slept within the stables themselves, on straw mats near the chains. Their families lived in huts nearby, shunned by other communities. They ate what was given: old rice, leftover grain, or the sugarcane peel discarded after elephants had eaten their fill. And yet some among them loved the elephants. The job of cleaner sometimes led to the slightly more prestigious role of mahout's apprentice, a chance to train and ride the elephants instead of just cleaning their waste. For this, a cleaner had to prove himself, not just through obedience, but by knowing each elephant's mood, favorite food, and even patterns of defecation. They learned the names of the beasts: Hasti, Kanchan, Vajra, Kalabra. They learned which ones could be approached from the left, which needed soothing chants, which kicked in their sleep. There was one story, passed orally, of a cleaner who rescued a baby elephant that had collapsed from exhaustion during a hot summer procession. He stood beside it all night, fanning it with palm leaves and massaging its legs. When it recovered, it refused to let anyone else near. Years later, that same elephant carried the royal standard in battle. These stories were rare. Most cleaners were never noticed. They were not mentioned in inscriptions or honored in court. But without them, the elephants would have suffered. And if the elephants suffered, so would the king. The stables themselves were massive, long stone halls with arched roofs divided by wooden partitions. Each elephant had its own stall, its own chain, its own grooming space. There were water troughs and fodder piles. There were carved stones for tusk sharpening, brass bells for announcements, and storage rooms filled with leather harnesses and ceremonial paint. And beneath it all, always beneath it all, was the waste. Some waste was burned, some was carried in baskets to be dumped outside city walls. Some, surprisingly, was used as fertilizer or fuel. There were entire industries that grew around animal waste in ancient India, and the elephant stable cleaners were part of this dirty economy. Still, their status remained low. They were not allowed to enter temples. They could not dine with the higher castes. Children born into these families were expected to carry on the work. Even their tools were marked, notched or painted to warn others not to touch them. But at night, when the stables quieted, when the elephants slept and the air cooled, some cleaners would sit on the edges of stone troughs and talk softly to the animals. They told them stories, sang old songs. Elephants were known to remember voices, to recognize faces even after years. And some, it said, mourned when their cleaners died. In the Mauryan records, especially those attributed to Kautilya, Chanakya, the royal advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, there are detailed sections in the Arthashastra about the care and use of elephants. It lays out feeding schedules, breeding practices, training methods, even punishment for neglect. Though it never names the cleaner, it does name his function. It is written that stables shall be cleared thrice daily, and that uncleaned waste shall be punished with deductions of grain or lashes. The manual makes it clear the empire ran not just on soldiers and scribes, but on the backs of those who served behind the veil of dung and danger. These cleaners were not just workers. They were the unsung spine of the Mauryan military machine. Without clean, healthy elephants, the empire could not fight. Without order in the stables, there was no order on the battlefield. And in this way, even the lowest job was part of the highest purpose. Today, ruins of Mauryan stables remain in parts of Bihar and eastern India. Stone troughs, drainage channels, and worn flagstones hint at the size and bustle of those ancient facilities. Archaeologists have found copper rings, tusk-smoothing tools, and inscriptions about feeding rotations. But there are no statues for the stable cleaners. No names. No prayers. No songs. Only the silent record of hands that labored in filth beneath the trumpet of kings to keep the might of an empire moving forward, one basket of dung at a time. Now we will walk through the mist-covered fields of Sengoku-era Japan, a time of civil war, shifting loyalties, and daily death. The ground is soaked with yesterday's blood. Crows circle above. The scent of iron and smoke clings to the air. The battle is over. The swords are sheathed. The banners lie torn. Samurai corpses, in dozens or even hundreds, now lie broken across the grass, some with eyes still open, others headless or pierced through with arrows. And somewhere on the edge of that carnage, a corpse handler kneels in silence, his face covered by cloth, his hands moving through the ritual of the dead. He is not a warrior. He is not a priest. He is something else, forgotten, unspoken, and utterly necessary. The samurai were bound by Bushido, the way of the warrior, a strict code of honor that placed immense value on death with dignity. But after death came another layer of duty. Someone had to retrieve the fallen, cleanse them, prepare them for burial, or in many cases, for cremation or decay. That job fell to men known by various titles: shinomono, kotsuhiki, or more often just the handlers. They were drawn from the lowest rungs of society, the untouchables, or burakumin, outcasts who dealt with blood, death, leather, and filth. Their work was seen as impure, but without them, the battlefield would rot. After each skirmish or full-scale war, these handlers were summoned to the field. Their job was both practical and spiritual. They removed weapons and armor from the dead. They inspected faces for identification, especially among samurai, who were expected to have died nobly. They gathered severed heads for their lords, a trophy system central to status in samurai warfare. It was not uncommon for a corpse handler to find a samurai's headless body, and beside it, the head wrapped carefully in silk, awaiting collection. Others were less ceremonious, torsos trampled, intestines trailing, eyes pecked by birds. The handler's tools were simple: cloth for wrapping, knives for loosening stiff joints, bamboo poles for lifting, urns for ashes, and a wooden ladle to scoop bodily fluids. His clothes were rough and dark, his hands stained, his breath quiet. But he was not just a cleaner. In many cases, especially under more devout lords or in Buddhist-leaning domains, handlers were trained to perform last rites. They would recite prayers over the bodies. They would arrange the limbs properly, hands placed on chests, feet straightened, mouths closed. This was especially critical for samurai suicides, seppuku or ritual disembowelment. These bodies were often found inside tents, surrounded by carefully placed objects, a short blade, a scroll of final words, a second sword from the Kaishakunin, or assistant who beheaded the dying man. Even here, the handler's role was vital. He cleaned the blood, he preserved the scroll, he ensured the dead warrior's appearance remained honorable for the funeral procession. No one thanked him. Handlers were rarely spoken to. They were often not allowed to live within city walls. Their homes were on the outskirts, in wooded groves beside rivers or near cremation fields. Their children inherited their status. Their touch was seen as spiritually contaminating, and yet their knowledge was respected in its own way. A skilled handler could recognize causes of death just by smell. He could lift a body without rupturing it. He could recite funerary sutras from memory. He knew the etiquette for different clans. He knew how to fold a body into a cremation basket without dishonoring the dead. He also knew silence, because on some days he found things he could not speak of. Evidence of cowardice, of friendly fire, of betrayal. A dagger in the back, a suicide left unfinished. He never reported it. That was not his role. The handlers also maintained the charnel pits, vast open graves where anonymous soldiers were dumped by the hundreds. Not all warriors received fine funerals. Foot soldiers, servants, and ronin often rotted where they fell. When there were too many, the handler lit them aflame, stoked the fires with pine branches, scattered ashes with prayer. In times of peace, the handler served in castle towns. His job shifted to the mortuary temples, where he prepared corpses for cremation or burial. He washed the bodies of samurai wives, nobles, and even children. He stitched up wounds, dressed the dead in fresh robes, and carried them to the pyre. Sometimes he found himself alone with a samurai lord's body. No other servants would enter. The handler alone bore witness to the ruler's final state. He alone saw the disease, the scars, the signs of age or sin, and he kept those secrets, always. But death was not his only burden. Many believed that the handler was spiritually cursed, that to touch the dead was to risk becoming Yuri, a restless spirit. Some handlers performed daily purification rituals. Others carried talismans to ward off ghosts. Still others burned herbs or slept with salt beneath their mats. They dreamed of the dead. Worse, some handlers found that the dead spoke back, not with voices, but with reminders. A pendant from a child, a love letter in a silk sleeve, a familiar tattoo. And yet they worked, quietly, diligently. The Bakufu government knew of their work, and while they shunned them publicly, they protected them privately. No one else would do what they did. Without the handler, the cities would drown in rot. The temples would stink of decay. The battlefield would become uninhabitable. Their tools were passed down from father to son or to apprentices. Each family line held its own rituals. Some taught songs to soothe the soul as it departed. Others burned a paper effigy beside every body. And on festival nights, when spirits were said to return during Obon, the festival of the dead, these handlers lit lanterns along riverbanks, guiding souls to peace, even the ones they themselves had once wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. Few monuments remain for them, but in the outskirts of ancient Kyoto and in the graves near old battlefields, inscriptions sometimes appear. To him who bore the weight of the fallen, to she who washed the blood from our lords, to the silent ones who made peace after war. They were the hidden hands behind every sword stroke, the quiet breath after every scream, the dignity after every disgrace. They were the corpse handlers of the samurai world, and without them, the legacy of Bushido would have been buried in chaos. Now we will leave behind the echo of swords and the march of armies. We will walk instead into alleyways where the air is thick with rot, where vats of dark liquid bubble in the sun, and where men bend over hides, soaked to their waists in urine, lime, and dung. This is the world of the tanner. Long before silk robes or leather armor graced the backs of nobles, someone had to cure the skins. Someone had to scrape the flesh, soak it in ammonia, and dye it by hand in pits that reeked of death. It was not a glamorous job. It was a sentence. Let us begin in Fez, in the heart of the medieval Islamic world. The Chawara tannery, still standing today, was already ancient by the 12th century. Its layout has changed little. From above, it looks like a honeycomb. Hundreds of stone vats, each filled with a different liquid, some pale and chalky, some bright yellow, others red as blood. Men move between them barefoot, lifting hides from vats of pigeon droppings. Why droppings? Because they contain ammonia, the essential chemical to soften the leather and dissolve fat. The stench is legendary. So foul, in fact, that tanneries were placed on the outskirts of cities. In some areas, workers chewed mint or cloves just to withstand the smell. The tanners of Fez lived in separate quarters, often among other stigmatized professions, butchers, executioners, those who dealt with the dead. They were tolerated, even respected for their skill, but no one wanted to stand downwind of them. Work began before sunrise. First, raw hides from sheep, goats, or cattle arrived, already stiff and stinking. They were soaked in water, then plunged into vats of quicklime to remove hair. Tanners scraped them with crescent-shaped knives, hunched over boards, their hands red and blistered from chemicals. Next came the softening stage, weeks in pits of dung, stirred by hand. Then came dyeing, saffron yellow, indigo blue, crimson from madder root or crushed insects. Each batch had to be turned and stirred. There were no gloves, no masks, just stained skin and hardened lungs. The end result? Leather for sandals, saddles, Quran bindings, belts, and scabbards. Items touched by princes and imams. All born from waste. Traveling east, let us now peer into medieval China, during the height of the Song dynasty. In cities like Kaifeng or Hangzhou, tanners were registered under the dirty trades, professions considered essential but impure. They worked beside dyers, morticians, and night soil collectors. Chinese medicine even warned against contact with tanners, claiming their bodies absorbed cold qi, energy from death and decay. But their work was everywhere. The imperial cavalry needed saddles and bridles. Archers used leather armor and arm guards. Bureaucrats and scholars prized soft leather scroll cases and slippers. Chinese tanneries were highly organized, often run by family guilds. Boys joined young. Apprentices began by carrying hides and stoking dye fires. Within years, they graduated to scraping, stretching, soaking. Every move was muscle memory. Every vat had its rhythm. The vats themselves were carved into earthen floors, lined with brick or clay. Ingredients were mixed with bamboo paddles, lime, plant ash, fermented bran, aged urine. Some mixtures were secret, passed from master to student. Despite the foulness, Chinese tanners were craftsmen. They prided themselves on producing soft leather known as grupi, used for ceremonial robes. The best hides were so supple they folded like silk. But the social cost was steep. Tanners were forbidden to intermarry with certain classes, their children were barred from official exams, some even had to pay special taxes. They lived on the outskirts, near waste pits and canals. When epidemics struck, their quarters were often blamed, and yet they endured, stitching their survival into every softened hide. Now, let us journey west, to medieval Europe, in cities like Florence, Paris, or York. Here, too, tanners were a class apart. In France, they worked along the Bièvre River, far from the perfumed quarters of nobility. In England, their neighborhoods were called tannery lanes, places of perpetual stench, always downwind. European tanning followed similar steps: washing, lining, fleshing, baiting, tanning. But here, hides were often baited, softened, with mixtures of dog feces and bird droppings stirred in by hand. It was cold, wet work. Winter froze the hides, summer made them rot. The tools were few: dull knives, wooden paddles, stone vats. The clothing was simple: aprons of stained canvas, caps to shield from rain and vomit. The smell was unbearable. Tanners were banned from public fountains, barbers refused them service, priests asked them to sit at the back of churches. Yet despite all this, leather was in constant demand for shoes, belts, armor straps, book bindings, and drinking flasks. In guild-led cities like Florence, tanners formed corporationi or associations to defend their trade. They lobbied for river access, they set prices, some even rose in wealth, but never fully escaped the stink of their profession. A traveling merchant in the 14th century once wrote, "You may dress a tanner in silk, but still he smells of death." Yet the paradox is this: these men worked closer to life than most. They touched the skin of animals that once breathed. They turned decay into beauty. They shaped the goods that would be held by popes, emperors, and scholars. And they did so anonymously. No one thanked the tanner for the boots that carried a crusader to Jerusalem. No one praised the tanner for the fine leather belt that held a knight's sword. No monk, copying sacred texts, paused to bless the hand that prepared the binding. But without that hand, the page would crumble, the shoe would rot, the saddle would snap. And so, the tanner returned each day to his vats, to the scraping boards, to the flies and the filth. He breathed in ammonia, he lost his fingernails, he buried friends who succumbed to lung sickness. Still, he worked. Because his leather had to last. Because the world demanded beauty born from waste. Because someone had to stand knee-deep in dung so that others could walk in pride. And even now, in old quarters of Fez or side streets of Florence, if you look carefully, you can still see the worn stones where tanners once stood. Still smell, faintly, the ghost of ancient labor. They were never named in books, but their work wrapped the very hands that wrote them. Now we will walk beneath the tall cedars of a forested Japanese estate, where the sun filters softly through mist and pine, and where the silence is broken not by swords, but by the cry of a hawk. Here, dressed in plain robes, stands a solitary figure with a leather glove and a hooded bird perched on his wrist. He is a takago, a falconer, and he serves not a merchant, not a farmer, but a daimyo, a powerful feudal lord whose leisure is as much political as it is personal. And though this falconer does not wield a katana or ride into war, his job is among the most exacting and demanding in the entire court. From a distance, falconry may seem serene, even noble, a pursuit of grace and harmony with nature. But for the falconer, it is a daily ritual of blood, discipline, and the constant threat of failure. The falcon he trains, whether hawk or goshawk, peregrine or sparrowhawk, is not a pet. It is a predator, a creature of instinct and power, and taming it requires not affection but control. A falcon is loyal only as long as it is fed and respected. One mistake, one slip in timing, and it will fly away forever, or worse, turn violent. In the medieval Japanese courts, falconry was a prestige ritual, one with deep cultural and even mystical significance. It was not merely hunting, it was performance, symbolism, and domination of nature, proof of a lord's refinement and authority. To be chosen as a falconer for a daimyo was both honor and burden. The falconer's duties began before dawn. He awoke when the forest was still black, when the roosters were just stirring in their pens. His first task was to inspect the hawks, to examine each one's talons, beak, wings, and eyes. A single cracked feather could mean a failed hunt. A slight change in weight might indicate illness. These birds were treated better than most servants. The falconer fed them a strict diet of fresh meat, often sparrow, rabbit, or even tiny fish, depending on the species. The meat was weighed and measured, cut to precise portions. Too much, and the bird would grow lazy. Too little, and it might grow aggressive. He maintained their hoods, their perches, their leashes. He kept their claws filed and their leg rings clean. He bathed them in shallow bowls, then dried their feathers with gentle cloths. All of this took place in silence, for the birds could be startled by sound. Some were trained to fly at whistle, others by hand signal. Each had its own temperament. The daimyo did not tolerate excuses. When he ordered a hunt, the falconer had to be ready within minutes, with the bird calm, alert, and perfectly conditioned. Then came the most difficult part, the flight. The falconer followed his lord into the fields or forest. He wore robes of subdued color, leather arm guards, and soft-soled sandals. His belt carried the tools of the trade, a lure made of feathers and bone, small knives for butchering prey, a flask for water, and sometimes a scroll for logging performance. At the moment of release, he removed the bird's hood. The falcon's eyes, now unshrouded, flared open, sharp, yellow, scanning for motion. A rabbit darted from a bush. The daimyo nodded. The falconer raised his arm, exhaled slowly, and sent the bird aloft with a practiced motion. The hawk soared. For a few seconds, everything held still. Then, a dive, a burst of feathers, a cry of prey. The hunt was successful. But sometimes it was not. The bird missed, or the prey escaped, or worse, the falcon flew off, ignoring the lure, ignoring the whistle. A lost bird was a disgrace, not just to the falconer, but to the daimyo himself. Punishment was swift. The falconer might be fined, beaten, or dismissed. Some falconers were branded for failure. To avoid such fate, the Takaho spent years in training. He learned the subtleties of wind. He memorized bird psychology. He could judge the health of a hawk by its excrement, its feathers, the angle of its stare. Many falconers were hereditary, sons of falconers, taught from boyhood. They were never samurai, but they lived near the castle, ate from its kitchens, and were trusted with the lord's favorite animals. If the daimyo traveled, the falconer came too, caring for the birds on boats, carts, and long marches. In some provinces, falconry schools were supported directly by the shogunate. The Tokugawa shoguns themselves were known patrons. A well-trained falcon was as much a status symbol as a fine sword or rare calligraphy scroll. Still, the work remained dirty, dangerous, and isolating. Hawks sometimes attacked their handlers. A misjudged grip could mean a torn cheek, a gouged eye, and training a new bird could take 6 months or more of daily handling. Wearing it on the glove, feeding it from the hand, accustoming it to men, dogs, horses, drums, and the movement of sleeves. Some birds never accepted it. They were wild at heart. These were culled or fed to other hawks. The falconer bore this without protest. He bore the cuts on his fingers, the blood under his nails. He bore the smell of raw meat, the endless nights watching over sick birds. He bore the contempt of courtiers, who viewed him as a beast keeper. He bore the jealousy of rivals, the whisper of spies who accused him of sabotage if a hunt went poorly. He bore it all for one reason: duty. He lived for the moment the hawk returned, wings outstretched, bearing a rabbit or pheasant in its talons, eyes gleaming with predatory joy. He lived for the silent nod of the daimyo, brief, but enough. At night, the falconer sat by torchlight, cleaning the feathers of his best bird. He whispered to it, he told it secrets. He had no wife, no children, just the hawk and the hunt, and the knowledge that he served something ancient and precise. Not a warrior, not a priest, but something in between. The last guardian of a ritual stretching back 1,000 years, where nobility and death met in a single flight. Now we turn our gaze to the moonlit rooftops of Babylon, where silence reigns and even the ziggurats seem to hold their breath. It is past midnight. The air is still and dry. In the courtyard of a temple dedicated to Nabu, the god of wisdom, a man stands alone on the smooth bricks of a raised platform. In one hand, he holds a stylus of sharpened reed. In the other, a half-baked clay tablet. Before him, the stars. This man is not a priest, though he walks among them. He is not a soldier, though kings listen when he speaks. He is not a god, though his predictions may decide who lives and who dies. He is a Babylonian star reader, a tupsaru, trained to study the heavens and record what the gods write there. His job is not poetic, it is dangerous. He does not watch the stars for pleasure, nor for inspiration. He watches, because if he fails to read the signs, the empire may fall, the king may die, famine may sweep the land. His mistake will not be forgiven. The job is ancient, stretching back to the 2nd millennium BCE, when the Babylonian Empire rose like a flame in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. The star reader was part astronomer, part priest, part political advisor. He worked in the service of the palace, the temple, and the calendar, and often he was a pawn to all three. In the city of Uruk, or later Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, the star reader began his day long before sunset. He fasted for purity, washed in sacred water, and prepared his tools: tablets, styluses, oil lamps, polished copper mirrors, and star charts carved into clay. When darkness fell, he climbed to the roof of the temple, often the ziggurat itself, a structure as high as 90 feet, its summit flat and bare save for an altar and observation post. There he sat and waited. He watched for Venus, for Jupiter, for the phases of the moon, for shooting stars and eclipses. He knew each fixed star by name: Shulpe, Nibiru, Mulmul, and he charted their movements like a banker tracks coin. If Venus disappeared for too long, it meant war. If a lunar eclipse occurred on the 15th day, it meant the king might die. If Mars hovered near the moon, there would be bloodshed. But the heavens did not always speak clearly. Some nights were cloudy. Some stars flickered falsely. The Tupsaru could not afford a single mistake. For this reason, he always worked in pairs. One watched, the other recorded. And when the gods made their signs, he took his stylus and etched the moment onto damp clay, quickly, with trembling fingers. The stars could not be delayed. The wind might dry the clay. He had to press the symbols cleanly: An, Gar, Ud, Limiu. Star names, angles, dates. These cuneiform signs, hundreds of them, were impressed onto clay tablets and stacked on drying racks. The temple stored them in archives that dated back centuries. A good reader consulted the past before writing the future. But the most critical readings did not stay in the temple. They were carried by runners to the palace at dawn. The king's vizier would unroll a leather case and inspect the clay for cracks, smears, and errors. A poorly written omen might be discarded. A too frightening one might be sealed and hidden. In the court of Babylon, omens could be crimes. If a tablet predicted the king's death, the reader could be blamed for causing it. If his tablet said there would be no eclipse, and the moon darkened anyway, he could be stripped of his post or, worse, accused of lying to the gods. Some Tupsaru were executed for false readings, others were blinded, many simply disappeared. But despite this, the job was coveted. It gave the reader access to the highest levels of power. He sat in the temple's inner sanctum. He walked beside generals. He advised queens on when to conceive, when to plant, when to avoid certain foods or colors. His word, or rather the gods' words, through him, could delay wars or marriages. He was feared, and he was often used. Sometimes a corrupt priest or courtier would bribe a reader to produce a favorable omen, one that warned against a rival or predicted the failure of a proposed alliance. The reader was caught between truth and survival. To survive, some learned to write in riddles. Instead of saying, "The king will die," they wrote, "If the sun rises red on the 3rd day after the full moon, and a star falls in the east, then let the highborn beware the scorpion's sting." Interpretation was everything. Other readers embedded contradictions, giving both good and bad outcomes. If Jupiter is bright, prosperity. If Jupiter is clouded, famine. In this way, they could always say they had been right. Still, the pressure was immense. Some went blind from peering at stars too long. Others developed tremors from years of writing on wet clay in the dark. Their fingernails cracked. Their robes stank of oil and sweat. They rarely married. They rarely laughed. They slept little. And when they did sleep, their dreams were haunted by stars. The clay tablets they left behind, hundreds of thousands of them, are now scattered in museums, mostly unread. but they speak of a world obsessed with time, fate, and celestial control. They include records like, Year of the eclipse, 4th month, 2nd night, Venus was invisible, on the 5th she appeared in the east. It is a bad omen for Elam, the king shall prevail. The moon was darkened on the 14th day, no winds blew, the dogs howled, this is the sign of pestilence, the temple must be purified. Or even, the stars are in their places. Let the people rejoice, no disaster shall come this year. Each one is a whisper from a man standing alone under the stars, heart pounding, stylus scratching, wondering what these tiny lights would bring. In time, Babylon fell. The ziggurats crumbled. The clay tablets were buried by sand and war. But the readers remained in Persia, in Greece, in Rome, always watching, always writing. And today, when we look at the stars and make a wish or read a horoscope, we are not so far from those quiet figures in linen robes, eyes raised, hands dirty with clay. They read the skies so their kings might sleep. They bore the burden of fate, and they did it in silence under moonlight. Now we look away from the polished corridors of palaces and step instead onto hot, rough stone, where flies buzz and the scent of blood hangs heavy in the morning air. The sun is rising above Tenochtitlan, casting golden light across the twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor, the sacred heart of the Aztec world. Now at the very top of those pyramids, some 90 steps above the sacred plaza, priests perform their rituals. Their chants echo like low thunder. Their hands, red and slick, lift a knife to the sky. The sacrifice is done. The body, now lifeless, is pushed down the steep staircase. It tumbles, limbs twisted, head lolling, until it reaches the base in a crumpled heap. Blood streaks the steps in thick crimson ribbons, steaming in the morning warmth. And now a figure begins to climb. Not a priest, not a warrior. He carries no obsidian, no feathered headdress, just a bundle of woven cloth, a wooden bucket, and a long-handled scraper made from bone. This is the blood cleaner, a servant whose name will not be recorded, whose prayers are whispered into rags, whose work must be invisible yet absolute. His job? To clean the temple before the next sacrifice. He starts at the top, he crouches low, he dips cloth into salt water mixed with herbs, scrubs the fresh blood until it smears into pink froth, then wipes again. For dried blood he uses the bone scraper, chiseling carefully so as not to damage the sacred steps. The stone is porous, the blood sticky. It seeps into cracks, collects in the crevices where thousands have died. The cleaner does not flinch. This is his role, and he performs it with the ritual discipline of a priest, the precision of a soldier, and the silence of a ghost. He was chosen for this job, not because he was holy or skilled, but because he was disposable. Often, the blood cleaner was a slave, a captured foreigner whose life had been spared not for mercy, but for labor. Sometimes he was a young acolyte, punished for disrespecting a god. In some cases, he was an orphan, raised within temple walls, told from childhood that this was his duty. He was not allowed to look directly at the sacrifices. He was not allowed to speak to the priests. He could not leave the temple grounds. He lived in a dark chamber beneath the pyramid, where mats were laid over stone floors and buckets lined the walls. At night, he rubbed his hands with ash to scrub away the smell. It never left. On feast days, like the festival of Tlacoxip-Willisli, the blood flowed like rain. Hundreds could be sacrificed in a single day. Heart after heart offered to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war. The bodies were flung down the stairs in a ghastly procession of limbs and silence. The cleaner followed after, wiping, scrubbing, scraping, dumping the waste into clay jars, which were then sealed and buried far from the temple. The priests said the blood nourished the gods. But the cleaner? He knew its smell too well. It smelled of metal, of sweat, of terror. It clung to his nose even in sleep. In dreams, he saw red footprints trailing behind him no matter how hard he cleaned. And he cleaned every day. Even when the skies turned gray with rain, even when the heat rose like fire from the stone, even when his knees bled from the rough steps, his job never changed. There was no applause, no reward. If he missed a spot, the head priest might beat him with a cane. If he complained, his tongue might be cut. If he fled, his skin would be used in the next ceremony, stretched over a drum, or worn as a mask. So he worked. Some cleaners developed a system. They carried lime to bleach the stone. They used obsidian flakes to gently polish surfaces without scratching them. They wrapped their hands in cotton strips to protect their fingers from cracking. They grew fast, nimble, silent. They learned to avoid the priest's eyes. They kept their heads low. They hummed the cleansing chants in whispers, never loud enough to offend. And in time they began to understand the layout of the pyramid better than anyone. Each groove, each crack, each channel where the blood pooled. Sometimes the cleaner worked side by side with another, a child or an old man too weak to fight. These partnerships never lasted long. One would disappear, another would die of fever. There was always someone to replace them. The temple steps were like a living creature, always hungry for blood, always thirsty for the quiet rhythm of cloth on stone. When the Spaniards arrived in 1519, they wrote of temples slick with gore, of staircases dyed red from decades of sacrifice. But what they did not see was the man who made those stairs passable, who kept the sacred clean. He was neither murderer nor saint. He was a cleaner, a servant to death, and his hands never stopped working. In the later days of the empire, as resistance grew and sacrifices increased to appease the gods, blood cleaners worked through the night. They were given extra rations, a rare kindness, but never rest. The gods demanded more hearts, more blood, more signs of devotion. The cleaner never asked why. He asked only where the stain had spread. He knew that if the stairs were not spotless by dawn, the next sacrifice might be him. There were whispers that sometimes a cleaner's blood was used in secret rites, that if a priest saw an ill omen in the stars, he might order a cleaner seized and flayed, his skin worn by a dancer in the festival of renewal. The cleaner himself never spoke of this. He had no one to tell. His was a nameless existence. Even the gods did not know his name. But without him, the ritual could not continue. Without him, the temple would rot under flies and shame. His rags were more vital than robes. His bucket more sacred than gold. He was invisible, but essential. And when the last blood ran down the steps of the Templo Mayor, when the final heart was offered, and the empire began to collapse, it was the cleaner who mopped it up. Alone, as always. Quiet, as always. And so, as the fires dim and the noise of ancient cities fades into the hush of night, we come to the end of our journey through the most twisted jobs in history. They were not heroes in golden armor. They were not poets or kings. They were the unseen, the unwanted, and yet they were vital. Their hands carried the burdens no one else dared touch. Their lives were marked by silence, shadows, and survival. We remember them not because their jobs were noble, but because they were human. And their work, for better or worse, kept the world turning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. It truly helps me keep making these calming, immersive journeys through time. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always brings me joy to see people from every corner of the world drifting off with these stories. Now close your eyes, let the past rest, and sleep well, my friends.